There is something strange about the way Australia's cities were founded. Not strange in the way that history books call things strange, meaning unusual or surprising. Strange in the way that silence is strange when you expect noise. Strange in the way that a locked door is strange, when you know something is on the other side and nobody can tell you what it is. The cities of Australia, the ones that became capitals, the ones that became the centres of government and culture and money, were not simply built on open land. They were built on top of things. The question of what exactly those things were has never been fully answered. The question of why nobody is asking more loudly is one that follows you once you start pulling on it. This is not a video about conspiracy. That word gets used too quickly when someone suggests that official history left something out. This is a video about what the ground holds. What survives when nobody is looking, what gets recorded in engineering logs and survey journals, and then quietly filed away. What the First Nations people of this continent have said for generations about the places where their ancestors lived, moved, and built, and about what happens when that knowledge meets the geology and the colonial record, and the pattern that starts to appear when you lay them side by side. We are going to go through every Australian capital city, one by one, slowly. We are going to look at what was found before the first colonial structures went up, what was reported during early construction, what was suppressed or misfiled or labelled inconclusive, and what the current ground surveys are still quietly noting without follow-up. This will take a while. I want it to take a while. That is the point. If you have been watching the channel for a while, you know how this goes. I do not rush these. I do not cut corners to hit a time limit. I sit with the material until it says what it actually means, and then I bring it to you as slowly and clearly as I can. If you are new here, welcome. Settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe make something warm to drink. Put on something soft. Let the video run. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Let us begin with Sydney, because Sydney is where the pattern starts. Sydney is where the colonial record begins in Australia. It is where the first official surveys were conducted, where the first engineering projects went underground, where the first formal documentation of the continent's ground was produced. And Sydney is where the first anomalies appeared. The geology beneath Sydney is Hawkesbury sandstone. It is a Triassic formation, roughly 230 million years old, laid down when this landmass was part of a different planetary arrangement entirely. The sandstone is not uniform. It is a system of interlocking layers and joint planes and what geologists call void-forming tendencies, places where the rock, under the right conditions of water, movement, and pressure and time, opens itself into chambers. Natural chambers occur in Hawkesbury sandstone. That is a known fact. It is taught in geology programs. It is noted in every major survey of Sydney's subsurface from the 19th century forward. What is less discussed is what happens to those natural chambers when they are shaped, when the joints are followed and widened, when the floors are leveled and the ceilings are cleared, when something that began as a geological feature becomes something that looks less like a cave and more like a room. The distinction matters. A cave is nature. A room is purpose. And the record beneath Sydney, the survey logs, the engineering diaries, the construction reports, contains descriptions that sit uncomfortably between those two categories. The Gadigal people are the First Nations custodians of the land that became Sydney. They have lived in relationship with the Hawkesbury sandstone for at least 65,000 years, possibly more. The sandstone is not incidental to their culture. It is central. The engravings are the most visible evidence, thousands of images carved into sandstone surfaces across the harbour basin, documenting animals, ceremonies, figures, relationships with country. But the engravings are the surface layer of something deeper. The oral traditions of the Gadigal and the broader Eora nation include consistent references to underground spaces, not caves in the casual sense. Specific locations, specific purposes, specific protocols around access. The language used in those traditions, when those traditions have been shared with researchers, describes underground places that were visited, that were used, that mattered. Not metaphorically, physically. When the first fleet arrived in 1788 and convict labour began reshaping the landscape almost immediately, the underground was encountered from the beginning. The early colonial records are not mysterious about this. They simply do not dwell on it. The first covered drains were constructed using what the records call pre-existing channels. The phrase appears in multiple early engineering logs without explanation. Pre-existing channels in the sandstone before the colonial construction. The engineers noted them, used them, and moved on. There was a settlement to build. There was no time for questions about where the channels came from. The 1793 survey, conducted under Governor Phillip's administration, contains a reference that became significant only in retrospect. A surveyor named in the official record only by his role Assistant Surveyor, Water Infrastructure noted what he called a pre-existing formation of considerable extent beneath the area that would become the commercial quarter of the settlement. The language in the original document is precise. Dressed faces on the channel walls, level floor, uniform width, directional bearing that does not correspond to natural water flow in the geology. He filed the report under drainage infrastructure and recommended that it be incorporated into the colonial water management plan. It was. The report was accepted, the formation was incorporated, and the note about its origin, about what made it a pre-existing formation with dressed faces, was never followed up officially. That report sat in the New South Wales Colonial Archive for a long time. It still sits there, in the sense that historical archives contain things that have not been read recently. The difficulty is not access in the technical sense. The difficulty is that the document is catalogued under drainage infrastructure, which means the only people likely to encounter it are those researching colonial water management, not those researching pre-colonial occupation. The categorization determines the audience. The audience determines whether the question gets asked. The question, what made those walls dressed before colonial construction, has not been formally asked by any public institution. In 1862, a survey team working on underground infrastructure in what was then the growing commercial district of Sydney encountered a passage. The survey report is held in the State Records of New South Wales. It describes a worked passage approximately 9 feet in height, with a level floor and smooth walls and a directional bearing they noted as NNE north-northeast that did not correspond to any colonial construction project in the area. The passage was not natural. The shape of it, the regularity of the floor, the consistency of the wall treatment, these are not characteristics of a geological void. They are characteristics of something that was made. The surveyors noted it, measured it, and filed the report. The report was marked for follow-up investigation. No follow-up investigation is recorded. 9 years later, in 1871, workers excavating foundations for a reservoir in Paddington encountered a chamber. The dimensions were recorded: 30 feet square, 40 feet in depth, 2 openings to passages running in different directions. The walls were described as dressed stone, not sandstone faces shaped by water. Dressed. The distinction is significant because dressed stone means deliberate shaping to a smooth, even surface. It means tool use. It means intention. The workers stopped. The site supervisor filed a report. The report noted the chamber and the passages and recommended investigation. The chamber was incorporated into the reservoir foundation. The passages were sealed. No investigation of their extent or origin was conducted. These 3 incidents, the 1793 report, the 1862 survey, the 1871 discovery, share a structure. Something pre-colonial is encountered. It is noted with some precision. It is incorporated or sealed. The recommendation for further investigation is made. The further investigation does not happen. Each time, the decision not to investigate is not recorded as a decision. It simply does not appear. There is no document that says we considered the pre-existing passage and decided not to investigate it. The investigation just fails to appear. The file closes. The next project begins. This is what makes the pattern interesting rather than conspiratorial. A conspiracy requires deliberate concealment with active coordination. What the Sydney record shows is something subtler and in some ways more troubling. It shows a system of categorization and institutional priority that makes certain questions not worth asking without anyone deciding that those questions should be suppressed. The drainage engineer is not suppressing evidence of pre-colonial construction. The drainage engineer is building a drain. The question of where the pre-existing channel came from is genuinely outside his professional scope. He notes it and moves on. And the next person who should ask the question never receives the note, because the note was filed under drainage. This is what institutional silence looks like from the inside. It does not feel like silence. It feels like productivity. The City Circle Railway was constructed between 1915 and 1926. It is a loop of tunnels that connects the major stations of the Sydney CBD beneath the streets: Town Hall, Wynyard, Circular Quay, St James, Museum, Central. The engineering project was one of the most significant underground construction efforts in Australian history at that time. It required boring through the Hawkesbury sandstone for kilometres. It required dealing with whatever the sandstone contained. The diaries of the engineering teams are held in various archives. Not all of them are easily locatable. Some have been digitised. Some remain in physical form in institutions that do not prioritise their public accessibility. What is findable within the findable materials contains entries that stand out. The alignment of the City Circle tunnels deviates in several places from the most direct path between stations. Some of these deviations have engineering explanations: avoiding existing infrastructure, managing gradient, accommodating geological formations. But in the zone between Town Hall and the area around Circular Quay, the deviation is notable. The tunnels go deeper and shift direction in ways that are not fully accounted for by the official engineering record. The depth at certain points exceeds what the surface grade and the known infrastructure density would require. In 1921, the New South Wales Department of Public Works produced an internal report on subsurface conditions in the CBD. The report has never been widely discussed. It is a technical document, not a historical one, and it is catalogued accordingly. Pages 11 through 13 contain a description of two zones, one beneath the Town Hall precinct, one in the southeastern section of the Circular Quay area where the surveyors noted what they called pre-existing voids of undetermined origin. The language in the original is careful. The authors noted that the voids showed evidence of deliberate modification. They used that phrase, deliberate modification, and recommended that the zones be treated as potentially significant for heritage purposes. The report also contained a recommendation that the heritage assessment be completed before construction in those zones proceeded. That recommendation was not followed. Construction proceeded. The voids were worked around or incorporated into the tunnel system depending on location. The heritage assessment was never completed. The recommendation sits in the document. The document sits in the archive. The archive is publicly accessible in principle. The 1921 report is interesting not just for what it says, but for what it does not say. It does not speculate about who made the modifications. It does not propose an origin. It identifies the features as pre-existing, notes that they show signs of deliberate shaping, and recommends further investigation. This is exactly what good engineering documentation should do. The features were pre-existing and modified deliberately by whom, for what purpose, in what period. Those questions were appropriately deferred to heritage specialists. The problem is that the heritage specialists were never brought in. The deferral became a permanent deferral. The questions remain in the document and nowhere else. This is worth sitting with. The people who wrote that 1921 report were not trying to hide anything. They were flagging something they did not have the expertise to characterize. They were doing their jobs correctly. The failure is not in the report. The failure is in what happened after the report, or rather, in what did not happen. Someone received the report. Someone decided that construction would proceed without the recommended heritage assessment. That person, or those people, are not documented. The decision to proceed is not documented. Only the original recommendation is documented, and only in the original report, and only if you know where to look. The Eastern Suburbs Railway was a later project, constructed in the late 1970s and early 1980s, extending the rail network southeast from the CBD. The engineering diaries from this project are more recent, and some are more accessible. 3 entries across the diary record are of particular interest. November 1979. A construction worker noted an unexpected void encountered during boring near what became Museum Station. The void was larger than the bore diameter. The entry describes a space that did not correspond to any known geological feature or prior construction. The void was assessed by a site supervisor and filled. The diary entry notes that the void was reported upward. No follow-up entry appears in the available record. March 1980. An engineer's diary entry describes encountering fitted stonework at a depth of approximately 60 feet during excavation in the southeastern section of the tunnel alignment. Fitted stonework, meaning stone placed in deliberate arrangement, not natural formation. At 60 feet of depth, the entry is brief. It notes the discovery, notes that the site supervisor was informed, and moves to the next item. There is no subsequent entry about the fitted stonework. The construction continued. September 1980. This entry is the longest of the 3 and the most specific. It describes a passage encountered near what became St. James Station, which is not on the eastern suburbs line, but is close enough to the work zone that the engineers were familiar with its subsurface area. The passage is described as 8 to 12 feet in height, dry, with still air, running beyond the range of the available lighting. The engineer writing the entry notes that he walked 40 feet into the passage before stopping. He describes the floor as even, the walls as regular, the ceiling as showing what he called squared faces. He describes the air as old, which is a phrase that appears in other underground survey descriptions to mean air that does not move, air that has been enclosed for a very long time. After 40 feet, he stopped and returned. 11 days elapsed before the next entry in his diary. When the next entry appears, the passage is not mentioned. The construction schedule continues as though the interruption did not happen. One word in the September entry is underlined. The word is outstanding. It appears in the sentence describing the condition of the passage walls. Outstanding. Underlined. In the handwriting of an engineer writing in a construction diary. What happens to an engineer who encounters a dry passage at 60 feet with squared ceiling faces and still air and walls in outstanding condition? What does that person do with that information? The diary suggests they reported it, and then the record goes quiet for 11 days, and then they went back to work. The word outstanding sits in the document. The passage sits beneath the city. The question of what it is has never been formally posed by any institution with the authority and resources to answer it. Melbourne is different from Sydney in its geology and in its colonial history, but the pattern that appears in its record is recognizably similar. The ground beneath Melbourne holds a different kind of evidence. What is consistent is the way that evidence was handled. The land that became Melbourne sits at the northern edge of Port Phillip Bay, at the point where the Yarra River meets the bay. The Kulin Nation, a confederacy of 5 First Nations groups, the Wurundjeri, the Boonwurrung, the Wathaurong, the Taungurung, and the Diyar Wurrung, have lived across this landscape for at least 40,000 years, probably considerably longer. The Yarra Valley is not simply a geographical feature in Kulin culture, it is a living entity. The river has a name and a character and a history that extends far beyond any colonial frame. The land around the river, the floodplains, the rises, the volcanic basalt flows that define the geology of central Melbourne has been shaped and managed by Kulin communities across an almost incomprehensible span of time. The geology of Melbourne is distinct from Sydney's. Melbourne does not have sandstone in the same sense. The central city sits on basalt volcanic rock, laid down in successive flows over millions of years, and beneath the basalt, in the deeper substrate, older sedimentary formations. The basalt is hard and resistant in a way that sandstone is not. It does not form the same kinds of natural voids. What it does is hold its shape when shaped. Basalt does not erode easily. What is carved into basalt tends to remain. There are references in the early colonial record to stonework encountered during the first major construction projects in central Melbourne. The city was formally established in 1835, and significant construction began almost immediately. The gold rush of the 1850s accelerated everything. Melbourne became, for a period in the second half of the 19th century, one of the wealthiest cities in the world per capita. The infrastructure built during that period was extensive and went deep. During the construction of the Melbourne sewerage system in the 1890s, a massive engineering project that fundamentally reshaped the underground of the central city workers encountered what the construction records describe as prior earthworks in several locations. The language is general. Prior earthworks, no further characterization, no dating, no assessment of origin. The MHIM works were incorporated into the sewerage project where possible and bypassed where not. The records note their existence the way you note a geological feature as a given, as something to work around, not as something to investigate. The Fitzroy Gardens, which sit adjacent to the CBD, have a history that goes beyond their colonial landscaping. The gardens were established on land that had been shaped before colonial arrival. There are references in 19th century correspondence, private letters, not official documents, to features found during the initial land preparation that were not consistent with natural ground formation. One letter, held in the State Library of Victoria and referenced in a 1970s local history publication, describes the discovery of what the writer called a stone arrangement of considerable antiquity during the initial clearing of the eastern section of the gardens. The stone arrangement was apparently substantial enough that it required significant labor to remove. The letter writer expresses curiosity about it. No official record of the discovery appears to exist. The Melbourne CBD itself, in its oldest section around Collins Street and Burke Street, sits over a basement level that has been progressively built upon since the 1840s. The phenomenon of Melbourne's hidden laneways and underground spaces is well known in a cultural sense. There are basement bars, underground car parks, pedestrian tunnels, all of which are publicly acknowledged. What is less discussed is the subsurface layer beneath those acknowledged spaces. The city has been built in strata. Each generation of construction added depth. And in those strata, in the transitions between one era of construction and another, things have been found that are not comfortably explained by the known timeline of Melbourne's development. In 2006, during excavation for a new development in the central city, workers encountered a section of stonework at a depth that placed it below the earliest known colonial construction in that area. The contractors noted it and contacted the relevant heritage authorities. The heritage assessment produced a finding of inconclusive origin, meaning the features could not be securely assigned to any known construction period. The development proceeded. The features were documented in the assessment, and the assessment was filed. The development is now complete. The inconclusive stonework is beneath it. The Wurundjeri oral tradition, as has been shared by Wurundjeri custodians in various published and recorded contexts, includes references to landscape features in the Yarra Valley and the surrounding hills that have specific ceremonial and practical significance. These features include elevated stone arrangements that functioned as astronomical markers, water management structures along the Yarra tributaries, and what are described as meeting places that were defined by physical modifications to the landscape. Some of these features are acknowledged in contemporary heritage assessments. Others are not, because they were removed or built over before any heritage framework existed that could recognise them. The underground of Melbourne holds something else that the colonial record does not account for: the depth of Kulin occupation. 40,000 years of continuous habitation on a landscape that was managed, shaped, and understood at a level of sophistication that is only beginning to be appreciated by Western institutions. In that time, things were built, things were modified, things were created that were meant to endure. The question is not whether those things exist. The question is whether the ground that was built upon in the 1840s and 1850s and 1890s and the 20th century contains traces of them. And the answer, based on the sporadic references in the colonial and construction record, is that it almost certainly does. The 1890s sewerage project is worth staying with a moment longer because of its scale. The project covered virtually the entire central city and extended into the inner suburbs. It was one of the most comprehensive underground engineering efforts in Australian colonial history. The workers who executed it went deep, encountered the baseline geology, and built on top of whatever was there. The construction records are held in Melbourne Water's archives, the successor institution to the original sewerage board. Those records are extensive. They document pipes and junctions and chambers and depths and materials. They also, in scattered entries across the project diary, note anomalies, features that did not match the expected ground, spaces that were larger than the natural geology should produce, stonework in places that had not previously been constructed upon. These entries are consistent with the Sydney pattern: noted, incorporated, or bypassed, not followed up. The failure to follow up is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the consistency of the pattern across two cities with different geologies, different colonial histories, different First Nations custodians, different engineering errors. The anomalies appear in the same way. They are treated in the same way. The documentation has the same shape. Something was encountered, it was noted, it was not investigated. The record closes, the project continues. Brisbane is the third capital, and it arrives with its own set of complications. The land that became Brisbane sits at a bend in the Brisbane River, on country belonging to the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. The Turrbal people's relationship with the river bend, the specific location where the city centre now stands, is deep and specific. It is not vague ancestral connection in the sense that the phrase is sometimes used dismissively. It is a precise, named, documented in oral tradition relationship with a specific landscape feature that was chosen as a river crossing point and a gathering place across tens of thousands of years. The Brisbane River Valley is geologically complex. The rock beneath the central city is a combination of phyllite, schist, and rhyolite metamorphic and volcanic formations that are ancient even by geological standards. These are not sedimentary rocks. They are rocks that have been subjected to enormous heat and pressure over long periods, producing a dense, hard matrix that resists erosion and holds its shape. When you modify phyllite or schist, the modification tends to last. The material is not sandstone that weathers gradually. It is close to permanent. The early colonial history of Brisbane differs from Sydney and Melbourne in one significant respect. The land was initially established as a penal colony specifically, not a free settlement. The convict era in Brisbane runs from the 1820s until the 1840s. During that period, convict labour was used extensively for infrastructure construction. The records of that labour are more complete in some respects than the records of free settler construction elsewhere. Convict movements were tracked, work assignments were logged, production was measured. These records, held in the Queensland State Archives, are a resource that has been used extensively by historians researching the convict era. They are less well examined for what they reveal about what the convict work gangs encountered. Several entries in the convict work assignment logs from the 1830s describe labour deployed to clear or fill what the superintendents called natural features in the riverbank and in the low rises to the west of the river. The phrase natural features appears in these contexts as a catch-all for anything found in the ground that was not expected and that needed to be dealt with. In a handful of entries from the years 1833 to 1837, the natural features in question are described in enough detail to suggest they were not natural in any strict sense. One entry from 1834 describes a work party directed to fill a void in the riverbank approximately 15 feet in width, with a regular cross-section. Another from 1836 describes stonework encountered during the clearing of a slope that required additional labour to remove because of its extent. The superintendent's note observes that the stonework was of significant age, using the phrase long established without specifying what that meant to him. The Brisbane River itself has been significantly modified since colonial arrival. Its banks have been built up, channeled, and in some sections entirely reshaped. The flood history of Brisbane, the city, has experienced catastrophic flooding multiple times. Most recently in 2011 and 2022 has resulted in repeated excavation and reconstruction of riverside infrastructure. Each major reconstruction event generates engineering documentation. That documentation, across the various flood repair and infrastructure upgrade projects of the 20th and 21st centuries, contains scattered references to features encountered below the colonial construction layer that are described as prior works. The 2011 flood and its aftermath resulted in significant excavation in the South Bank area across the river from the central business district. During the repair and reconstruction work, engineers working at depth in several locations noted what was described in technical reports as anomalous compaction patterns in the subsoil. Anomalous compaction means the ground is compressed in ways that do not correspond to natural settlement or to the known history of construction on the site. It means something was there before something heavy and organized enough to compress the soil differently from the surrounding material. The reports note it as an engineering datum, something to account for in the structural planning. They do not speculate about origin. The Turrbal oral tradition includes specific references to places along the river that were used for purposes that required specific preparation of the ground. The preparation of the ground is not described in terms that translate directly into engineering language, but the descriptions are consistent with sites where significant activity occurred over long periods where the land was shaped in ways that left traces. Elders who have spoken about these sites in published academic contexts describe them as places the river remembers. The phrase is not metaphorical in the way it might sound to a Western listener. It is a description of a specific quality of those locations, the way they retain the memory of what happened there, encoded in the physical landscape itself. What the river remembers and what the engineering surveys have noted are two different kinds of knowing about the same ground. They have not been formally brought into conversation with each other in any Brisbane heritage process. The planning framework that governs the heritage assessment of development projects in Brisbane does not currently include a mechanism for correlating oral tradition accounts of site significance with the anomaly records in engineering. Documentation. These two bodies of knowledge exist in parallel. They have not been asked to speak to each other. The Story Bridge, which spans the Brisbane River and is one of the city's defining landmarks, was constructed in the late 1930s. The foundation works for the bridge pylons went deep into the river geology. The engineering records of the foundation works are detailed and technical. They also contain, in the documentation of one of the eastern foundations, a reference to a pre-existing void at significant depth that required additional concrete to fill. The void is described as roughly circular in cross-section, approximately 12 feet in diameter, with walls that showed evidence of former use. The phrase "former use" is not elaborated. The void was filled. The bridge stands on top of it. A 12-foot circular void with walls showing evidence of former use at the depth of a bridge foundation in the Brisbane River in geology that does not naturally produce circular voids of that regularity. The engineering team filled it and noted it. The note sits in the archive. Nobody has asked what it was. Adelaide is the planned city. That is how it is described in Australian history, the city that was surveyed and laid out before it was settled, the product of deliberate design rather than organic colonial growth. Colonel William Light surveyed the site and produced the famous grid plan in 1836, placing the city on a flat plain between the Mount Lofts Ranges to the east and the Gulf St. Vincent to the west, with the River Torrens running through what became the Northern Parklands boundary. The planned nature of Adelaide is offered as a point of civic pride, and the plan is genuinely elegant, the grid of the city surrounded by a belt of public parklands, designed so that the city could expand without ever losing its green boundary. What is less discussed in the civic narrative is what Light found when he surveyed the site, and what was already there. The Kaurna people are the First Nations custodians of the Adelaide Plains. Their country extends from the southern tip of the Fleurieu Peninsula to the northern boundary of the Adelaide Plains, and from the Gulf St. Vincent coast to the Mount Lofts Ranges. The Adelaide city site falls within the most central and significant portion of Kaurna country. The Kaurna relationship with this landscape, with the rivers, the plains, the ranges, the springs, is documented in oral tradition, in the work of early colonial ethnographers who actually listened to what they were told, and in the physical evidence of camps, ceremonial sites, and land management that was present when the survey was conducted. Light's survey notes, which are held in the State Records of South Australia, are detailed engineering documents. They record the topography, the water sources, the soil types, the vegetation. They also, in several entries, record the presence of features that Light interpreted as Aboriginal earthworks. He used that term Aboriginal earthworks in at least 3 locations in his survey notes, describing ground modifications that were not natural formations. In 2 cases, he noted the earthworks as potentially significant for understanding prior occupation patterns. In one case, he noted a formation of organized stones on the eastern boundary of what became the planned city grid that he described as a structure of some kind. Light's architectural training, he was a military engineer, meant he was better equipped than most colonial surveyors to recognize deliberate construction when he saw it. His assessment that the stone formation was a structure of some kind was not casual. He knew what structures looked like. He knew what they did not look like. The formation was a structure. What became of that formation is not documented. The development of Adelaide proceeded according to Light's plan. The eastern grid boundary was built. The formation was in the path of development. There is no subsequent record of it. The parklands around Adelaide, the green belt that surrounds the city in Light's design, have been a complicated heritage space since the city's foundation. They were designated as public open space, partly because they were already significant to the Kaurna people. The designation of the parklands was not purely altruistic in its origin. There were practical considerations of land use and public health and colonial planning. But there is also evidence that Light was aware of the significance of the parklands area to the Kaurna, and that this influenced, at least partially, the decision to designate rather than develop them. This means that the parklands contain, potentially, a higher density of undisturbed pre-colonial landscape features than the city grid. They have been managed as public open space for nearly 2 centuries, which means the ground has not been excavated to the same depth as the urban core. Features that would have been disturbed or destroyed by deep construction in the city may survive in the parklands at or near the surface. Systematic heritage surveys of the Adelaide parklands have been conducted at various points over the past 3 decades. Those surveys have identified numerous sites of Kaurna cultural significance. They have also, in the technical documentation, Noted subsurface anomalies that were not investigated as part of the surveys, features identified by ground-penetrating radar or resistivity testing that showed patterns inconsistent with natural geology but were outside the scope of the survey mandate. The documentation notes the anomalies and defers their investigation to future heritage work. The future heritage work has not been conducted. The River Torrens, which runs through the northern parklands, was significantly modified in the 20th century. A weir was constructed, and the river was impounded to form what became known as the Adelaide Parklands Lake, a long, narrow artificial lake that replaced a section of natural river. The construction of the weir and the associated bank works in the 1930s involved excavation along the riverbanks. The engineering records of those works note, in two separate entries, the discovery of stone arrangements along the river margin that were assessed by the site engineer as being of Aboriginal origin. The arrangements were removed or submerged by the impoundment. No heritage assessment of them was conducted because no heritage framework for First Nations sites existed in South Australia in the 1930s that could have required one. What was submerged under the Adelaide Parklands Lake has never been surveyed. The lake is not deep enough to prevent survey ground-penetrating sonar of the kind used in underwater archaeology would be perfectly adequate for the task. The survey has not been conducted. The arrangements that the 1930s engineers noted as being of Aboriginal origin are beneath the water of an artificial lake in the middle of the parklands of Australia's most planned city. And nobody has looked at them since they were submerged. The city of Adelaide was built in full knowledge that it was being built on Kaurna country. Light's survey notes make clear that he understood this. The colonial administration understood it. The parklands designation shows some awareness of the significance of the landscape to its custodians. And yet the physical evidence of that custodianship, the earthworks, the stone arrangements, the features that Light's own notes described as structures, was built over, submerged, removed, and not documented to any standard that allows its recovery. This is the Adelaide pattern. Not ignorance. Light was not ignorant. Not accident. The submerging of the river arrangements was the consequence of a deliberate infrastructure project. It is the pattern of a system that acknowledges the prior presence without creating any mechanism to understand or preserve what that presence produced. The acknowledgement and the erasure exist side by side. The erasure wins because it is backed by concrete and engineering budgets and institutional momentum. The acknowledgement remains in the survey notes, in the archive, in the record of what was seen before it was covered over. Perth presents the most geologically distinct case of all the Australian capitals. It sits on the Swan Coastal Plain, a low-lying strip of land between the Darling Scarp to the east and the Indian Ocean to the west. The plain is composed largely of sand and limestone. Tamala limestone, a formation of consolidated dune sand that ranges in age and density, and that has been the substrate for human occupation of the coastal plain for at least 50,000 years. The Whadjuk Noongar people are the First Nations custodians of the Perth region. Their country covers the southwestern corner of the continent, and within that country, the coastal plain and the Swan River system have been central to Whadjuk life across deep time. The Swan River, called Durbal Yerrigan in the Noongar language, is not a geographical feature. It is a living ancestor with a specific identity and a specific set of relationships with the people of its country. The Noongar relationship with the coastal plain extends through the full depth of human occupation of the continent. Whatever happened on that plain, whatever was built, whatever was shaped, whatever was used across 50,000 years or more, the Whadjuk Noongar people carry knowledge of it. The Tamala limestone beneath Perth and the surrounding coastal plain is a cave-forming geology. This is not disputed. The limestone aquifer system of the Swan coastal plain is known to contain extensive cave formations documented, mapped, studied by geologists and speleologists for over a century. The caves are natural, in the sense that the initial voids are formed by groundwater moving through soluble rock. What happens within those caves over 50,000 years of human occupation of the surrounding landscape is a different question. The inland sections of the Swan Coastal Plain, particularly in the limestone ridges to the north and east of Perth, contain documented cave sites with evidence of human occupation extending tens of thousands of years. These are known archaeological sites. They are managed under heritage frameworks. The Perth CBD and inner city, however, sit on a different section of the coastal plain geology, an area that has been extensively modified by colonial and post-colonial development, and where the subsurface has not been surveyed to the same standard as the inland cave sites. During the construction of Perth's underground railway system, the Perth City Link project, which involved significant underground work in the CBD, in the 2010s engineering documentation noted voids in the Tamala limestone at various points along the tunnel alignment. Some of these voids were small and clearly natural dissolution features. Others were larger and less clearly characterized. The engineering documentation describes one void in particular, encountered at a depth of approximately 20 meters in the limestone beneath the city center, as showing what the engineers called anomalous internal geometry. The geometry was not consistent with natural dissolution patterns. The void had flat sections. It had what the report described as modified surfaces in two locations. The report classified it as a complex dissolution feature, and the void was grouted and the construction continued. Modified surfaces in a limestone cave beneath the Perth CBD, not the limestone ridges to the north, where cave archaeology is known and studied. Beneath the city itself, the engineers called it a complex dissolution feature. The classification puts it in the natural category, which means no heritage notification was required, which means no archaeological assessment was conducted. The classification may be correct. Limestone dissolution can produce complex internal geometry. But modified surfaces are not a product of dissolution. Modified surfaces mean something was there and something happened to those surfaces. The classification resolves the question by not asking it. The Swan River was significantly modified during the early colonial period and continues to be modified by ongoing management. Harbour works, channel deepening, bank stabilization, the river has been engineered repeatedly across the colonial and post-colonial period. Each major river engineering project has involved work in the riverbed and along the riverbanks. The most recent significant dredging operation, conducted to maintain the navigability of the harbour, produced spoil that was assessed for archaeological content before disposal. The assessment found no significant material. What the dredge spoil assessment found was determined by what it was designed to look for. The assessment protocol specified material types consistent with known historical wreck sites and colonial-era dumping. It was not designed to identify modified stone from the limestone formations of the river margins. If modified limestone were present in the spoil, the assessment protocol as designed would not have flagged it as significant. The assessment found what it was designed to find, and did not find what it was not designed to look for. The Noongar oral tradition holds specific knowledge about the Swan River that extends back through deep time. This knowledge includes references to the river's course changing over geological time, which it has. The Swan River's course has shifted significantly across the time frame of human occupation of the coastal plain, and Noongar oral tradition has been used by geographers to track some of those shifts. It also includes references to places along the river and the coastal plain that have specific significance not fully accounted for in the current heritage register. These places have been identified by Noongar elders in consultations conducted for various development projects. In some cases, the consultations resulted in modifications to project designs. In others, the consultation record noted the significance, and the project proceeded anyway. Perth is also unusual among Australian capitals in that it has one of the most extensively documented pre-colonial land use histories in the country. The work of early colonial recorders like Daisy Bates, however fraught her methods were, produced a body of documentation about Noongar country that has been mined by researchers for decades. Within that documentation are references to constructed features of the landscape that go beyond stone arrangements and fish traps. There are references to modified ground at specific locations, to earthworks of a kind that served purposes the documentation does not fully characterize, to features that the colonial witnesses struggled to place within their categories of what First Nations peoples built and did not build. Those references sit in the ethnographic record. They have not been systematically cross-referenced with the engineering anomaly documentation from the construction projects that have built Perth's modern form. Nobody has sat down with the Bates Archive and the Perth City Link engineering records and the Swan River Dredge reports and asked whether they are describing the same places in different languages. That work has not been done. It could be done. The materials exist. The will has not existed in any institution with the resources to do it. Hobart is the second oldest capital city in Australia, founded in 1804 on the banks of the Derwent River in Van Diemen's Land. The land belongs to the Palawa people, the First Nations peoples of the island that became Tasmania, who have lived on this island for at least 40,000 years and possibly considerably longer, having been separated from the mainland by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, an event that the Palawa oral tradition records with a specificity that has been confirmed by geological evidence. The geology beneath Hobart is dolerite. The mountain that dominates the city Kunanyi, or Mount Wellington as it appears on most maps, is a massive dolerite intrusion, and the rock that forms the city's foundation is part of the same geological body. Dolerite is an igneous rock, very hard, very dense. It does not form natural voids in the way limestone or sandstone do. What happens in dolerite when it is worked is that the marks of working remain. Dolerite surfaces that have been shaped by tools hold that shaping for extremely long periods because the rock resists weathering. The early colonial history of Hobart includes an extensive record of quarrying. The city was built of stone, and that stone was quarried from the same dolerite formations that underlie the site. The colonial quarrying record is well documented because stone was an economic product as well as a building material, and economic products were tracked. What the quarrying record also documents, incidentally and without comment, is what the quarry workers found beneath the surface. Several entries in quarrying logs from the 1820s and 1830s, the period of most intense early colonial construction in Hobart, describe encountering worked faces in the stone that could not be attributed to the current quarrying operation. A worked face in a quarry is a section of rock that has been shaped by tools cut or leveled or dressed, and the marks of those tools are visible. When a quarry worker encounters a worked face that their own team did not produce, the question of who produced it is obvious. The question was apparently not worth pursuing in colonial Van Diemen's Land, because the quarrying logs note it and continue, but the entries exist. The most specific of these entries, from an 1831 quarrying log held in the Archives Office of Tasmania, describes a worked section of dolerite at a depth of approximately 12 feet below the ground surface in a quarry being worked on the western slopes of what is now the lower CBD. The worker who made the entry described the worked section as showing what he called regular cutting not made by our tools. Regular cutting, the marks of a systematic cutting action that did not match the tools and methods being used by his own team. The entry was made, the worked section was quarried away along with the surrounding rock, and no investigation of the prior cutting was conducted. The Palawa people, whose culture was devastated by the colonial violence of the early 19th century, what historians now largely call genocide, had a relationship with the landscape of Tasmania that extended across the full time frame of their occupation of the island. That relationship included the shaping of stone, Palawa stone tools and the marks of their use are documented across the archaeological record of Tasmania. What is less often considered is whether the most durable expressions of that shaping systematic modifications to the dolerite formations that underlie Hobart survived to the colonial period and were encountered and destroyed by colonial quarrying before anyone understood what they were looking at. The quarrying logs suggest that something was encountered. The worked faces that could not be attributed to the current team. The regular cutting not made by our tools. What was quarried away in the 1820s and 1830s from those Hobart hillsides is gone. The dolerite is gone. The evidence is gone. But the record of its encounter survives in the archive, filed under quarrying operations, waiting for someone to read it as something other than a record of stone extraction. Darwin is the most recent of the Australian capitals to be formally established, and it has a history that differs in significant ways from the southern capitals. The land belongs to the Larrakia people, whose country covers the Darwin region and the surrounding area. The Larrakia have occupied this landscape for at least 50,000 years. The northern part of Australia was among the first areas settled during the initial human colonization of the continent. The geology of the Darwin area is complex. The Darwin CBD sits on a sandstone ridge, not Hawkesbury sandstone, but a different formation. Cretaceous in age, softer and more weathered than Sydney's Triassic sandstone, but still capable of holding shape when modified. Beneath the sandstone, deeper substrate formations extend down to the Precambrian basement of the continent. Darwin's colonial history includes something that the other capital cities do not have in quite the same form: the Second World War. Darwin was bombed by Japanese aircraft in February 1942. More bombs were dropped on Darwin that day than on Pearl Harbor, and the city was subsequently a major military base for Allied operations in the Pacific. That military occupation of the landscape involved extensive underground works: tunnels, bunkers, fuel storage facilities, ammunition storage. The underground of Darwin was shaped deliberately and extensively for military purposes during the war. The military underground is documented in the historical record. Some of it is accessible as heritage tourism. The oil storage tunnels on the Darwin waterfront are a visitor attraction, cut into the sandstone ridge for fuel storage during the war. What is less often considered is the relationship between the military tunnels and whatever was in the sandstone before the military arrived. The Larrakia oral tradition includes references to underground features in the Darwin sandstone that predate the colonial and military periods. Larrakia custodians have spoken about specific locations where underground spaces were known and used by their ancestors, places with specific cultural and ceremonial significance that happened to be in the same sandstone formations, that were later tunneled by the military. The military engineers, working under wartime urgency, did not conduct heritage surveys. They did not consult with Larrakia knowledge holders. They cut where the stone allowed and built what the war required. Whether any military tunnel encountered pre-existing features in the Darwin sandstone, and whether those features were noted and what happened to the documentation if they were, is a question that sits in the military engineering records of the period. Those records are held in the Australian War Memorial and the National Archives. They have been studied extensively by military historians. They have not been studied systematically for incidental evidence of pre-existing underground features by anyone with a heritage research interest in the Larrakia cultural landscape. Two different bodies of knowledge, two different archives, two different research communities. The question of whether they describe the same places sits between them, in a gap that no research program has yet decided to cross. Canberra is the exception among Australian capitals in that it was chosen and designed specifically to be the capital, a purpose-built city on a site selected after lengthy political negotiation between New South Wales and Victoria. The site on the limestone plains was chosen in the early 20th century, and the city was designed by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney Griffin, who won the International Design Competition in 1912. The formal establishment of Canberra as the national capital occurred in 1913. The limestone plains were not uninhabited. The Ngunnawal people, along with the Ngambri, have occupied this region for at least 21,000 years, since before the last glacial maximum, when the climate of the region was colder and the vegetation was more open, and the landscape was different in ways that the Ngunnawal oral tradition records. The limestone plains in Ngunnawal country were not a blank slate available for capital city planning. They were a landscape shaped by human occupation over deep time, with specific features and places that carried specific significance. The name Canberra itself is derived from a Ngunnawal word. There is debate about the precise word and its meaning, but the most widely accepted interpretation relates to a meeting place, a place where people came together. This is not a coincidence of naming. The site on the limestone plains was a meeting place in the specific, formal sense of that term, a location where different groups gathered for ceremony, trade, negotiation, and the maintenance of relationships across country. Meeting places in the First Nations context of southeastern Australia were not random. They were chosen, prepared, maintained. The preparation and maintenance of a meeting place over 20,000 years leaves traces. The limestone plains geology includes, as the name suggests, limestone. And limestone, as already established in the Perth discussion, is a cave-forming geology. The ACT region contains known cave systems in the limestone formations to the south and east of the city. The limestone beneath the city itself has not been comprehensively surveyed for cave features. The construction of Canberra, which proceeded in stages across the 20th century and accelerated in the second half, involved extensive earthworks on the limestone plains. Those earthworks were conducted on a geology that is known to contain voids and that has been occupied for 20,000 years. The Parliamentary Triangle, the area at the heart of Griffin's design, bounded by the axes from Parliament House, the Australian War Memorial, and the National Library, sits on what was the most intensively used section of the limestone plains in the pre-colonial period. It is where the meeting place was. The construction of the Parliamentary Triangle's buildings and grounds involved significant excavation. Parliament House itself, the current Parliament House, which was built in the 1980s, involved the excavation of an entire hill and the construction of an underground complex that is largely invisible from the surface. The engineering records of the Parliament House construction are detailed and specific. They describe the geology encountered at various depths, the groundwater conditions, the structural decisions made in response to the site conditions. They also, in scattered entries, describe voids encountered in the limestone beneath the hillside. Some of these voids were clearly natural dissolution features. At least one void, described in the geotechnical report for the eastern section of the site, was characterized as showing internal geometry inconsistent with natural formation. Internal geometry inconsistent with natural formation. In the limestone beneath the hill that was excavated to build Parliament House. In the site that was the meeting place for 20,000 years of Ngunnawal occupation of the limestone plains. The geotechnical report is an engineering document. It was produced to support structural decisions about the building. The void with inconsistent internal geometry was filled and the construction proceeded. The report notes the void's characteristics and moves to the next engineering question. This is appropriate for a geotechnical report. It is not the end of the question. The Ngunnawal Nation has been involved in the cultural heritage processes associated with the ACT for decades. Ngunnawal representatives sit on heritage advisory bodies. Ngunnawal cultural heritage assessments are conducted for development projects in the ACT. There is a level of formal engagement with Ngunnawal knowledge that is more developed in the ACT than in some of the other capital cities, partly because of the relatively recent establishment of the city and the development of more sophisticated heritage frameworks in the latter part of the 20th century. And yet the specific question of the pre-colonial physical landscape of the Parliamentary Triangle, what was on that hill before the hill was removed, what was in the limestone beneath it, what the ground remembers of 20,000 years of meeting place activity, has not been the subject of a systematic investigation that combines Ngunnawal oral knowledge with geotechnical data and archaeological survey. The investigations that have occurred have been of heritage items, stone arrangements, scarred trees, ochre sources. The underground dimension has not been systematically explored. The Griffin plan for Canberra was deeply influenced by ideas about the symbolic significance of landscape. The axes of the city were designed to align with specific landscape features, to create meaningful geometric relationships between buildings and hills and water. Whether Griffin was aware of the pre-existing significance of those landscape features, whether the geometry of the Ngunnawal meeting place influenced, consciously or otherwise, the geometry that the Griffins chose for the capital is a question that has been raised in academic contexts and not resolved. The convergence is there. The axes of Griffin's Canberra point toward the same features that the Ngunnawal tradition identifies as the defining elements of the meeting place. Whether this is coincidence, unconscious response to the inherent logic of the landscape, or something else is unknown. Canberra is the capital built on a meeting place. The meeting place was 20,000 years old when the city was planned. The city's design mirrors the geometry of the meeting place, without that mirroring being fully explained. Beneath the city, in the limestone geology, are voids that the engineering record notes as inconsistent with natural formation. The records sit in the archives. The questions sit in the records. The meeting place is now a capital, and the history of what made it a meeting place in the first place is beneath it, in the ground, waiting. We have now moved through every Australian capital: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Hobart, Darwin, Canberra, 8 cities, 8 different geologies, 8 different First Nations nations with different cultures, different traditions, different relationships with their country. 8 different colonial founding histories, different timelines, different social conditions, different purposes, and across all 8, the same pattern. Pre-existing features encountered during construction. Features noted with enough precision to suggest they are not natural. Features that are incorporated, bypassed, filled, or removed. Recommendations for further investigation that are not followed. Records that end without the investigation they called for. And in each city, underlying all of it, a First Nations oral tradition that carries knowledge of that landscape across a time frame that dwarfs the colonial period. Before we talk about what the pattern might mean, it is worth being careful about what the pattern does not mean. It does not mean that every colonial surveyor and engineer was engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to conceal evidence of pre-colonial construction. The people who wrote those entries in those diaries and logs were not, for the most part, aware of the larger pattern of which their entry was a part. The drainage engineer in Sydney was not in communication with the quarry supervisor in Hobart. The engineer who filled the void under Parliament House in Canberra was not consulting with the contractors who bypassed the anomalous compaction zones in Brisbane. They were doing their jobs in their time, in the context of their professional obligations and institutional priorities. What the pattern represents is something that does not require coordination to operate. It is a structural consequence of 2 things: a categorization system that sorted evidence of pre-colonial occupation into the wrong category, and an institutional framework that generated questions it was not designed to answer and therefore did not answer. The drainage engineer categorized the dress channel walls as a drainage feature because he worked in drainage. The quarry supervisor categorized the worked faces as an obstacle to be removed because he worked in quarrying. The geotechnical engineer categorized the anomalous internal geometry as a complex dissolution feature because the alternative classification archaeological site of unknown origin would have required a process that his report was not equipped to initiate. Each person acted within their professional scope. The pattern is the aggregate of those individual acts of professional appropriateness. This is important to understand because it changes what the solution looks like. If the pattern were the product of conspiracy, of deliberate, coordinated suppression, the solution would require exposing and dismantling the conspiracy. But that is not what this is. What this is a systemic gap between what the ground contains and what the institutions tasked with managing the ground are designed to find and document and preserve. The solution is not exposure. The solution is design. The heritage frameworks, the research programs, the institutional mandates need to be designed to close the gap. And the gap is specific. The gap is between the technical anomaly documentation in engineering records and the oral knowledge held by First Nations custodians. These two bodies of evidence are describing the same physical landscape. They are doing so in different languages, through different institutions, with different purposes. They have not been systematically brought into conversation with each other. When they are brought into conversation not in an adversarial way, not in a way that demands one body of knowledge validate the other, but in a genuine collaborative investigation, what they produce is something that neither produces alone. The engineering anomalies become locatable on the cultural map. The oral knowledge becomes grounded in physical evidence. The questions that neither can answer alone become answerable together. This has happened in small and partial ways in various places. The Brewarina fish traps in New South Wales, engineering structures of enormous sophistication built in the Darwin River by the Ngamba people, were not recognised by colonial authorities as constructed works for decades after colonial arrival. They were eventually recognised, and their recognition required exactly the convergence described above. The technical analysis of the stonework, which showed clear evidence of deliberate construction, alongside the oral tradition that described their construction and use and maintenance. The two bodies of evidence together produced a recognition that neither produced alone. What happened at Brewarina could happen beneath the cities. The technical records exist, the oral knowledge exists. The gap between them is not a gap in evidence. It is a gap in institutional will and institutional design. It is a gap in the research programs and funding structures and heritage frameworks that determine what questions get asked. It is a gap that could be closed if the resources were directed toward closing it. Why have the resources not been directed? This is the harder question. The easier answer is institutional inertia. The heritage frameworks were not designed with this question in mind, and redesigning them is slow and complicated and requires political will that has been slow to materialize. This is true, but it is not the whole answer. The fuller answer involves something more uncomfortable: the implications of the answer. If systematic investigation of the subsurface of Australian capital cities produced clear evidence of substantial pre-colonial construction, evidence of built environments, of infrastructure, of organised modification of the ground beneath the places that are now the seats of Australian governmental authority, the consequences for the narrative of Australian history would be significant, not destabilising in the catastrophic sense, not threatening to the legal or political foundations of the current state, but significant. The pre-colonial history of this continent, as it is taught and understood and publicly narrated, would need to be substantially revised. This is not a reason not to investigate. It is a description of why investigation has been slow. The findings would complicate the story. Institutions that manage the story have a structural interest in not complicating it, even when no individual within those institutions is consciously managing the story in that direction. The interest operates at the institutional level, shaping what questions get funded and what questions do not, which mandates are broad enough to find what is there and which are narrow enough to ensure that they find only what is expected. The ground beneath the cities is patient. It has been patient for 50,000 years. It will continue to be patient. The question of whether human institutions will develop the capacity to ask the right questions before the evidence is further destroyed by development is more urgent. The urban development pipeline in every Australian capital is long and deep. Tunnels, basements, foundations, utilities, the underground of these cities is being progressively reshaped at significant depth. Every project that proceeds without a heritage mandate broad enough to capture evidence of pre-colonial construction is a project that may be destroying evidence of pre-colonial construction without knowing it. The evidence that was encountered in the construction records discussed in this video was encountered incidentally by workers who were not looking for it and were not equipped to assess it. The evidence that was not encountered is not in any record at all. It simply disappeared, unnoticed, into the concrete and the fill and the permanent underground of cities that will stand for another century at least. There is a background argument that runs beneath everything discussed so far, and it needs to be addressed directly. The question of whether First Nations Australians built things that could have left the kind of evidence we are discussing. The answer, based on the established archaeological and anthropological record, is unambiguously yes. The Brew Arena fish traps have already been mentioned. They are one of the oldest constructed works on the continent. Estimates of their age range from 6,000 to as many as 40,000 years, and their engineering is sophisticated. The structure extends for hundreds of meters along the Barwon River, using carefully placed stones to create a system of interconnected traps and channels that exploits the natural flow of the river to capture fish. The system requires an understanding of hydrology, of fish behavior, of stone placement under flowing water, of maintenance and repair cycles. It was not built by accident. It was built by engineers who understood their material and their environment at a level that took Western observers decades to recognize. The eel traps of the Western District of Victoria are another example. The Djab Wurrung and Jadwadjali people constructed a system of stone and wood channels and ponds across the wetlands of Budj Bim, the volcanic landscape of southwestern Victoria, that managed the movement of eels across a complex of seasonal waterways. The system was extensive. It covered hundreds of hectares. It involved channels cut through basalt, stone-walled ponds, tidal management structures, and a sophisticated understanding of the seasonal flooding and drying patterns of the wetlands. The system is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is dated at approximately 6,600 years old, one of the oldest aquaculture systems documented anywhere in the world. What makes Budj Bim significant for this discussion is not just its age or its sophistication, it is its permanence. The stone channels and ponds of Budj Bim survived 6,000 years without maintenance because basalt is durable and the system was well built. If the people who built the Budj Bim system had built something comparable in the limestone beneath Canberra, or in the dolerite beneath Hobart, or in the sandstone beneath Sydney, the structural durability of those geologies would mean that the works would have the same potential to survive to the present. The materials are right. The engineering sophistication is established. The question is not whether the First Nations peoples of these regions could have built things. The question is whether they did build things in the specific locations that became the capital cities. And the specific locations that became the capital cities were, in each case, the most significant locations in their respective countries. Meeting places, river crossings, elevated positions with broad views, sheltered harbours with reliable water. The places that European colonists selected for their cities were selected for the same reasons that First Nations peoples had made them significant. They were the best locations in the landscape, which means they were the locations most likely to have been most intensively occupied and modified over the longest periods. The colonial logic of site selection converged with the pre-colonial reality of site significance. The places chosen to be cities were already the most important places, and the most important places are the most likely to show the evidence of what importance looks like in the physical landscape. The stone engravings of the Sydney Basin cover an area of enormous extent. The petroglyphs in the Hunter Valley and in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park represent thousands of individual images, many of them large-scale and requiring significant sustained effort to produce. The people who produced these engravings across the Sydney Basin were capable of sustained, organized, skilled stone working at scale. That is established by the engravings themselves. The question of whether those same skills were applied to underground construction, to the modification of the sandstone passages and chambers that the engineering records describe encountering, is a question that the engravings establish as plausible. The capability was there. Whether it was applied is the open question. The language used in some Aboriginal Australian oral traditions about underground spaces is specific in ways that suggest functional knowledge. The traditions of various groups across the continent describe underground locations not as mythological spaces or metaphorical places, but as physical locations with physical characteristics and physical purposes. Water storage, protection from extreme heat, refuge during periods of violence or environmental stress. The underground in First Nations Australian traditions is not primarily a spiritual realm. It is, in many accounts, a practical one, a dimension of the landscape that was used, understood, and maintained. When oral traditions describe using the underground, it is worth asking what that use looked like physically. Stoneworking skills, a deep knowledge of local geology, practical reasons to use underground spaces, evidence of modification in the subsurface records of the cities built on the most significant landscapes. The elements are there. The question is whether any institution with the resources and authority to answer it will ask it. Some researchers have been asking it, quietly, in specialist publications, in funding applications that are sometimes declined and sometimes not, in consultations with First Nations custodians that produce more questions than answers and are the better for it. The research community, working at this intersection of underground heritage, of First Nations oral tradition, of colonial archival records, of geotechnical anomaly documentation, is small, but it exists. The people in it are doing careful work with limited support. One researcher, working in the Sydney Basin over the past decade, has produced 2 papers examining the relationship between Gadigal oral tradition accounts of underground significance and the specific anomaly locations in the colonial and modern engineering record. The correspondence between the 2 bodies of evidence is significant in both papers. It is not conclusive, the researcher is careful about this, but it is significant enough to have attracted commentary from both heritage scholars and geologists. The funding applications that followed the papers were not successful. The research continues on whatever resources the researcher can assemble. A geologist with 3 decades of experience working in Hawkesbury sandstone formation analysis has reviewed the 1,862 and 1,921 Sydney reports in the context of that research. His assessment, offered informally and referenced in the second paper, is direct. The features described in the 1862 report are not consistent with natural void formation in Hawkesbury sandstone. The directionality, the floor level, the wall treatment, the dimensions, these are not characteristics of a geological feature. They are characteristics of something that was made. He is a geologist saying that the passage described in the 1862 survey report was not made by geology. A geologist saying a feature was not made by geology. That assessment sits in a paper in a specialist journal. The specialist journal is publicly accessible. The paper has been read by the people who are likely to encounter it in their field. It has not been read by the people who manage the heritage framework for the Sydney CBD. It has not been read by the engineers planning the next phase of metro construction in the anomaly zones. It has not produced a heritage review of the 1,862 survey location. The paper exists. The question it raises exists. The institutional response has not materialized. This is the state of the research, not absence. Not nothing. A body of work that is developing, that is careful, that is asking real questions with appropriate rigor, and a set of institutions that manage the physical landscape in question that have not yet found the will to engage with what the research is producing. Let us talk about what is missing. Because the evidence presented in this video is, by any honest accounting, fragmentary. It is the evidence that survived the entries that were made in the diaries and logs before the diaries and logs were reorganized or misfiled or damaged, or simply never digitized into a form that made them searchable. The evidence that survived is significant. The evidence that did not survive is a subject for careful thought. Archives have gaps. Every major archive has gaps. The gaps in historical records are not always meaningful. Paper degrades. Records are lost in fires and floods. Reorganization schemes leave things in wrong locations, and effective inaccessibility is functionally the same as loss. The existence of a gap in an archive does not mean that something was deliberately removed. Most gaps are the product of time and entropy and the imperfect systems that humans use to manage information. But some gaps are structured. A structured gap is one where the absence of information is non-random, where the missing records cluster around specific subjects or specific time periods or specific locations in ways that are statistically unlikely to be the product of entropy alone. The missing records do not need to have been deliberately removed to be structured. Institutional practice shapes what gets recorded and how thoroughly and how it gets catalogued. And institutional practice is responsive to institutional priorities. Records of things that matter get kept more carefully than records of things that do not matter. If pre-colonial construction features were systematically treated as not mattering as an irrelevant complication of development projects rather than as heritage evidence worth preserving, the records of those features would be kept less carefully and would survive at lower rates. The structured gap is the product of institutional practice, not necessarily of deliberate destruction. In the NSW State Archives, the records of the 1921 Department of Public Works report, the one with the pages 11 through 13, describing deliberate modification in the town hall and circular key zones, sit in a collection that is accessible. What is notable about the surrounding archive is the relative scarcity of follow-up documentation in the years immediately following the report. Between 1922 and approximately 1935. In the folders immediately following the 1921 report in the archival sequence, there is a pattern of administrative correspondence about infrastructure projects in the CBD that references the report but addresses only its engineering recommendations, not its heritage observations. The heritage observation pages 11 through 13 are referenced nowhere in the subsequent correspondence. They are in the original document. They are not followed up, and for approximately 13 years of administrative correspondence, they are not mentioned. A 13-year gap in the institutional attention to a specific section of a specific report is not proof of anything. It is consistent with institutional indifference, with the heritage question simply not being within the professional scope of the engineers and administrators who read the report for its engineering content. But it is also consistent with something else. The kind of deliberate institutional decision not to follow up on something that results from an explicit conversation that itself is not documented. We decided not to investigate this. That conversation, if it happened, would not necessarily produce a written record. The absence of follow-up would look exactly the same whether the decision was made explicitly or never made at all. The archive cannot tell us which it was. The archive can only show us that the 13 pages are there and the follow-up is not. What we do with that is a judgment call. The Queensland State Archives contain the construction logs from the Brisbane River engineering projects of the 1890s and early 1900s. These logs were partially digitised as part of a heritage digitisation program in the 2010s. The partial digitisation is significant. Some of the volumes were digitized in full, some were digitized partially, and some were not digitized at all. The selection criteria for what was prioritized in the digitization is not publicly documented. What is known is that several of the volumes containing the most anomaly-relevant entries from the riverbank excavation projects are among the volumes that were not digitized. They exist in physical form in the archive. They are accessible with advance notice and appropriate credentials. They have not been made searchable in the way that a digitized document is searchable. If you are not specifically looking for references to prior earthworks in the Brisbane River margin, you will not find them by searching the digital collection, because they are not in the digital collection. This is not a conspiracy. The digitization program had a budget and a timeline and made choices about what to prioritize. The choices probably were not made with any awareness of the prior earthworks references in the undigitized volumes. But the consequence of the choice, whatever the motivation, is that the most relevant documents are the least accessible. The pattern of accessibility matches the pattern of inconvenience. The most inconvenient material is the hardest to find. The Melbourne Water Archive, the successor to the 1890s Sewerage Board, is held partly in the Public Record Office Victoria and partly in Melbourne Water's own institutional records. The division of the archive between two institutions is a consequence of the various administrative reorganisations that Victorian water management has undergone over the past century. Items from the same project can sit in different collections in different institutions, and finding all the relevant material requires searching both. The anomaly entries in the 1890s sewerage project logs are distributed across this divided collection. Some are in the Public Record Office, some are in Melbourne Water's own holdings. A researcher trying to build a complete picture of the anomaly documentation in the 1890s sewerage project needs access to both collections and needs to know that both are relevant. That knowledge is not obvious. It requires either prior familiarity with the institutional history of Victorian water management or a significant research investment to discover. The result is that the body of evidence is more complete than any single researcher has yet assembled, because assembling it requires navigating institutional divisions that are themselves a product of a century of administrative history. The evidence exists. Its distribution across multiple institutions makes it less visible than it would be if it were consolidated. The consolidation has not happened. These are the structural conditions that shape the gap in knowledge about the subsurface of Australian capital cities. Not conspiracy. Structure. The structure of archiving, the structure of categorization, the structure of institutional mandate, the structure of research funding, the structure of what gets digitized and what does not. These structural conditions are not neutral. They have the effect of maintaining a gap between the evidence and the knowledge that the evidence could produce. That gap is maintained without anyone intending to maintain it, by the aggregate operation of systems that were not designed to close it and have not been redesigned. There is a resistance, in some quarters, to treating oral tradition as evidence. The resistance takes various forms. The epistemological form. Oral tradition is story, and story changes over time, and changed story is unreliable as a historical record. The cultural form. Oral tradition in non-Western cultures is treated as mythology, and mythology is treated as decorative rather than informative. The institutional form, heritage and archaeological frameworks in Australia and elsewhere were designed primarily to work with physical evidence and documentary records, and they lack developed protocols for incorporating oral tradition as evidence of equal standing. Each of these forms of resistance has some legitimate basis, and each is more limited than it appears. The epistemological argument that oral tradition changes over time and is therefore unreliable has been substantially revised by research over the past 30 years. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian peoples have been tested against geological, astronomical, and ecological evidence in a number of cases, and the results are remarkable. Research published in peer-reviewed journals has demonstrated that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately describe sea level changes, the progressive inundation of the coastal plain as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, across a period from approximately 10,000 to approximately 7,000 years ago. The oral traditions describe specific coastlines, specific flooding events, specific changes to the landscape that can be independently confirmed by geological evidence of sea level history. Traditions about the coastline 10,000 years ago, maintained orally across 300 generations, are geologically accurate. Traditions that accurately describe coastlines from 10,000 years ago can accurately describe landscape features from 500 years ago. The argument that oral tradition is inherently unreliable, as historical evidence is contradicted by the evidence of its reliability across tested cases. The oral traditions of First Nations, Australian peoples, are not unreliable. They are a different kind of record, one that requires different interpretive frameworks and different cross-referencing methods than a written document, but they are not unreliable. The cultural argument that oral tradition is mythology rather than history reflects a categorical distinction that is imposed from outside. The distinction between mythology and history is not universal. It is a specific product of a particular Western intellectual tradition that separates the narrative of creation and meaning from the narrative of events. In First Nations, Australian traditions, these are not separate categories. The dreaming is not mythology in the sense of fiction or decoration. It is a record of the world, of how the world is, and how it came to be, that is simultaneously spiritual, ecological, historical, and practical. Treating it as mythology in the dismissive sense is a misapplication of a category that does not translate. The institutional argument that heritage frameworks lack protocols for treating oral tradition as evidence is the most practically significant of the three, and the most directly addressed by recent changes in heritage law. Practice. The recognition of First Nations cultural heritage in Australian law has expanded significantly over the past 3 decades. The protocols for consulting with First Nations custodians in heritage assessments are more developed than they were. The Standing on Country policy frameworks adopted by some Australian state governments represent a genuine shift in the institutional approach to First Nations heritage knowledge. The shift is uneven across jurisdictions and is not yet complete, but the direction is clear. Oral tradition is increasingly recognized within formal heritage frameworks as a legitimate form of evidence that deserves serious engagement. The question is whether this recognition extends to the specific domain discussed in this video, to the oral knowledge of underground features, of constructed spaces beneath the surface of what became capital cities. The extension of recognition from the general principle to the specific application is always slower than the adoption of the general principle. The principle is there, the specific application is pending. What would it look like to treat oral tradition and engineering anomaly documentation as co-equal bodies of evidence in a heritage investigation? It would look like a research partnership. Not a consultation in the colonial sense, not asking First Nations custodians to validate findings that researchers have already made, but a genuine partnership in which the knowledge of Gadigal custodians, or Wurundjeri custodians, or Ngunnawal custodians, or Quanah custodians, shapes the research questions, not just the process. The underground features described in colonial construction records, the passages, the chambers, the dressed walls, the fitted stonework, would be located within the cultural map that oral tradition provides. The oral tradition accounts of underground significance would be grounded in the physical evidence that the engineering records describe. The two would speak to each other. This is what good heritage research looks like. It is also what it would take to actually answer the question this video has been circling for the past several hours. Not to prove a predetermined conclusion, but to find out what is actually there. What actually happened in the underground of the places that became the capital cities of Australia. What the ground actually holds. The investigation is possible. The partnership is possible. The will is the variable. The will lives in institutions. Institutions are made of people. People are reading this question in journal articles, in heritage assessments, in this video, and some of them are in the positions where the decision to investigate or not to investigate gets made. The question is reaching the people who can do something with it. Whether it reaches them with enough force to change the calculation that has, so far, resulted in the gap remaining a gap is unknown. But the question is in motion. There is something worth naming about the experience of researching this material. The archives are public, the engineering records are accessible. The oral tradition accounts that have been published or recorded are findable. The academic papers that examine the overlap between these bodies of evidence are real. None of this is exotic or esoteric. It is sitting in libraries and online databases and institutional repositories, waiting for someone to assemble it. The assembly reveals something. The something is not certain. It is a body of consistent anomalies, pointing in a consistent direction, but it is significant. And the significance has been, so far, insufficient to produce the institutional response that the significance calls for. That gap between what the evidence suggests and what the institutions have done with it is itself part of the story. The evidence does not fail to produce action because it is insufficient. It fails to produce action because the system that should receive it and act on it is not designed to receive it in this form or act on it for these reasons. The evidence falls into a space between disciplines, between institutions, between knowledge systems. It belongs to all of them and is fully housed by none of them. It persists in that in-between space, accumulating slowly, waiting for the design of the receiving system to change. I want to slow down for a moment. We have covered a lot of ground, 8 cities, 8 geologies, 8 sets of archival records, arguments about epistemology and institutional design and research methodology. These things matter. They are why the question is a real question and not a fant ground. But they can obscure something that is easier to hold on to and in some ways more important. Beneath the city where you live, if you live in Australia or beneath any city you have ever lived in or visited, the ground holds time, not in a metaphorical sense, literally. The sediment layers are a record of everything that happened at that location, laid down in sequence, compressed and preserved by geology. Archaeologists read that record by excavating carefully. Geologists read it by drilling and analyzing cores. The record is there regardless of whether anyone is reading it. What the material in this video suggests is that in the specific locations where Australia's capital cities stand places chosen for their natural advantages, places that were the most important locations in their respective First Nations countries, places where human beings had lived and worked and built for tens of thousands of years before colonial arrival. The geological record includes something that the standard institutional story of Australian history has not accounted for. Not because the evidence is absent, because the institutions that manage the ground have not been designed to find it or to know what to do with it when they find it incidentally. The cities are on top of something. That something is still there. Beneath the concrete and the foundations and the drainage pipes and the metro tunnels and the utility corridors, the cities are heavy. What is underneath them is compressed and sealed in ways that actually favor preservation in certain geologies. The aerated zone of Hawkesbury sandstone keeps things dry, basalt holds its shape across deep time, dolerite resists weathering, limestone preserves what it encloses. The weight of the cities above does not necessarily destroy what is below. It may simply hold it in place. The question of what is being held in place by the weight of Sydney, by the weight of Melbourne, by the weight of Canberra's parliamentary precinct over its limestone meeting place, by the weight of Hobart's colonial buildings over its dolerite quarry faces, is the question that has not been answered. It is a real question about real physical things in real locations. The locations are known, or approximately known. The investigation is technically feasible. The heritage frameworks are moving, however slowly, in a direction that makes the investigation more possible than it was 20 years ago. The research community is small but active. The answer is not impossible. It has simply not been sought by anyone with the authority and resources to find it. This is a strange condition for a country to be in. Australia is a wealthy country with significant institutional resources. Its universities are research active. Its heritage agencies have, in principle, both the mandate and the capacity to investigate questions of pre-colonial occupation. Its First Nations communities are increasingly empowered to advocate for the investigation of their cultural heritage rather than its continued suppression. The conditions for investigation are better than they have ever been since colonial arrival. The investigation has not happened. The most honest characterization of the situation is this: Australia has not yet decided that it wants to know what is beneath its cities. Not collectively, not institutionally, not in the form of a National Heritage Research Program or a capital city subsurface survey or a systematic cross-referencing of engineering records and oral tradition. The decision has not been made because it has not been posed. It has not been posed because the people who would pose it, heritage researchers, First Nations advocates, curious engineers, investigative historians, are working in systems that are not designed to translate their individual questioning into institutional action. The question sits in the space between individual curiosity and institutional capacity. It is bigger than an individual can answer. It is smaller than an institution has yet decided to address. It lives in that gap, alive and patient, in the way that things beneath cities are patient because they have no choice. Sometime in the next 50 years, a tunnel will be bored somewhere beneath one of the Australian capitals and something will be encountered. A passage, a chamber, stonework that should not be where it is. The encounter will be noted. The project will continue. And somewhere in the documentation of that project, a sentence will be written that describes what was found in the language of engineering and categorizes it as an obstacle or an anomaly and moves on. And somewhere in that sentence, the question that this video has been about will be asked again, in the passive voice, filed under the wrong heading, waiting. Or, and this is the other possibility, the heritage framework will have been redesigned by then. The research partnership will exist. The institutional mandate will be broad enough to require investigation rather than bypass. The Gadigal custodian, or the Wurundjeri elder, or the Ghana knowledge holder will have been part of the project design from the beginning, not the consultation process at the end. And when the passage is encountered, the question will be asked differently. Not what do we do with this obstacle, but what is this place, and what do we know about it? And what does the ground remember? That is the other possibility. It is a real possibility. The direction of change in Australian heritage law and practice, however slow, points toward it. The research community working at this intersection is building the knowledge base that would make it possible. The First Nations advocacy for the recognition of cultural heritage is strengthening the institutional case for it. The other possibility is real. Which possibility prevails is not determined yet. It is being determined now by the people who make decisions about research funding and heritage framework design and what questions get asked in the institutional context that manages these things. It is also being determined by the broader public conversation about what Australian history is, what it contains, what it owes to the people whose country it was built on. These conversations are happening. They are slow and complicated and sometimes painful, and they are happening. The ground is patient. It has been patient for 50,000 years, and it will be patient for the resolution of a public conversation that has been underway for 3 decades and is not yet complete. What the ground holds will be there when the conversation reaches a point where the investigation becomes possible. The question is whether enough is left undisturbed for the investigation to find it. That question is urgent in a way that the ground's patience is not. The development pipeline does not share the ground's patience. The tunnels and basements and foundations being planned and approved and constructed right now are not waiting for the heritage framework to catch up. They are proceeding on the basis of the heritage framework as it currently exists, which is not yet designed to find what the ground may hold. Every project that proceeds under the current framework in the anomaly zones identified in this video is a project that may be destroying evidence without knowing it. The urgency is real. The patience of the ground is not an argument for proceeding slowly. It is a description of the physical durability of what has been preserved so far. That durability will not protect the evidence from concrete. Nothing protects evidence from concrete except the decision to look before you pour. It is late now, or early. Depending on when you are reading this, the city above you is either quiet or about to become quiet. The traffic has slowed or has not started yet. The people who move the city through its daytime hours are asleep or not yet awake. The city at this hour is a different thing than the city in full operation. The hum is lower. The weight seems to shift slightly, settling into itself. The way a building settles in winter when the temperature drops and the materials contract and the structure finds its equilibrium for the night. Sydney at this hour is still massive. Even at 3 in the morning, the lights are on in windows across the harbour. The bridge is lit. The ferries have stopped running, but the harbour is not dark. The water catches the light from the North Shore and from the CBD and from the ships at anchor and makes something of it. The city spreads in every direction, heavy and bright, extending across the sandstone basin in the way that the colonial settlement began to extend almost 230 years ago. Beneath the harbour, beneath the streets, beneath the foundations that have been accumulating since 1788, the sandstone is in the dark. The aerated zone is dry. The passages that the 1,862 survey described are in the dark. The chamber at Paddington, 30 feet square, 40 feet deep, 2 openings to passages, is in the dark. The St. James Passage that the eastern suburbs engineer walked 40 feet into before stopping is in the dark. Still air. Outstanding walls. They have been in the dark for a very long time. The surveys came and went. The construction came and went. The city grew and kept growing. The darkness in those passages is older than the city above them. It predates the colonial settlement. It predates the memory of anyone living. It extends back into the time before time was counted the way we count it. Melbourne at this hour is cold. The Yarra moves through the parklands in the dark, the way it has moved since long before the city existed. The basalt beneath the CBD is at its most purely itself at this hour, unmediated by the noise and movement and heat of the daytime city. The prior earthworks noted in the 1890s, sewerage logs are in the basalt somewhere, if they survived the sewerage construction. The stonework encountered during the central city development in 2006, the inconclusive origin stonework, is beneath the building that was constructed after the assessment. The building is lit at the upper floors. The ground is dark below. Brisbane is warm even at this hour. The river bends in the dark the way it has always bent, the topographic logic of the landscape asserting itself beneath the colonial geometry of the city. The Story Bridge spans the river with its enormous anchored structure. The pylons sunk deep into the riverbed geology, the 12-foot circular void with its walls showing evidence of former use sitting somewhere in the concrete below the waterline. The river moves past the void. The city is above. The darkness is between. Adelaide is quiet at this hour in the way that planned cities are quiet. The grid absorbs the silence and distributes it evenly. No irregularity of street or building to catch sound and transform it. The parklands are very dark on the outer edges, the trees tall enough to block the light from the streets. The Adelaide Parklands Lake is still. Beneath the lake, in the mud of the impounded river bottom, the stone arrangements noted by the 1930s engineers are where they were when the water rose over them. The mud has settled around them across 90 years of impoundment. They have not moved. They are beneath the still surface of the lake, in the dark, in the mud, in the ground. Perth faces the Indian Ocean. Even at this hour, the ocean is enormous and present, the smell of it reaching the city, the sound of the water audible from the coastal suburbs. The limestone beneath the CBD is dry in the upper layers and wet in the lower. The aquifer system that has been studied and mapped and drawn on for drinking water extending beneath the city in a network that is well understood in its hydrogeological dimensions and less well understood in its archaeological ones. The void with anomalous internal geometry beneath the CBD was grouted during the city link construction. The concrete is set. Whatever the internal geometry described is in the concrete now, held in place permanently. The modified surfaces are enclosed in their grout. The geometry is fixed. Hobart is cold and still. The dolerite of the mountain above the city is very dark, the rock absorbing the available light in the way that dark rock does. The quarry faces of the 1820s and 1830s are long since built over. The regular cutting not made by our tools has been part of the foundation geology of the city for nearly 2 centuries. The worked sections that the convict-era quarrymen noted and quarried away are gone. The ones they did not note are still there, possibly in the dolerite that the colonial construction did not reach. The mountain is patient, in the way that igneous rock is patient, formed under conditions of pressure and heat that are incomprehensible in human terms, changed by nothing that happens on the surface in human timescales. The marks of tools in dolerite are marks for as long as the dolerite stands. The dolerite will stand for longer than the city. Darwin is warm in the way that the tropics are warm even before dawn, the heat of the previous day stored in the ground and the buildings and releasing slowly through the night. The sandstone ridge on which the city sits is orange in daylight and dark at this hour. The oil storage tunnels on the waterfront, the wartime military tunnels that are now a tourist site, are locked and dark and empty. The sandstone beyond their walls, in the formations that the tunneling did not reach, holds whatever the sandstone holds. If the Larrakia oral tradition's references to underground significance in the Darwin sandstone correspond to physical features, those features are in the sandstone in the dark. The military engineers did not find them, because the military engineers were not looking for them. They may be there. Canberra is very quiet at this hour, the way government cities are quiet when the government is not in session. The parliamentary triangle is lit in the way that national monuments are lit, the buildings luminous against the dark, the geometry of Griffin's axes visible in the patterns of light along the avenues. Beneath the triangle, in the limestone, the void with internal geometry inconsistent with natural formation is in the concrete that was poured to build the foundation of Parliament House. The limestone meeting place, 20,000 years old, the site of gathering and ceremony across the full depth of Ngunnawal occupation of the limestone plains, is in the dark beneath the National Parliament. The two things occupy the same ground. The Parliament is above. The meeting place is below. The meeting place was there first. It was there for 20,000 years before the Parliament arrived. It will be there, in some form, for as long as the limestone holds. These cities are heavy. Their weight is real, and it is permanent. What is beneath them is also real. The weight of the city does not erase what it presses down on. It preserves it in the way that pressure preserves things, in the way that darkness preserves things that do not need light to exist. The ground beneath every Australian capital city holds time. It holds the record of what happened before the record was written. It holds the evidence that the institutional record has not yet found, or has found and not known what to do with, or has found and categorized as something other than what it is. The evidence is in the ground. The time is in the ground. The patience is in the ground. The question is whether we are, eventually, going to look. Let us be specific about what investigation would look like. Because one of the ways that questions like this stay unanswered is by remaining vague, remaining at the level of a general call for more research, a general acknowledgement that something should be done, without the specificity that would make the call actionable. What would actually need to happen to answer the question this video has been asking? The first step is archival consolidation. The engineering anomaly documentation, scattered across the public records agencies of the various states and the ACT, needs to be identified and consolidated into a form that allows comparative analysis. This is a research project, not a political one. It requires a team with the historical training to find the relevant documents across multiple institutional collections, the technical background to understand what the engineering language means, and the time and funding to do the work systematically. The output would be a database of anomaly locations, descriptions, depths, and associated documentation across all 8 capital cities. This database does not exist. It could exist. The material to build it is in public archives. The second step is spatial correlation. The anomaly locations identified in Step 1 need to be mapped, placed in their precise geographic position, using the historical descriptions and the known geography of each city. This requires converting 19th and early 20th century engineering coordinates into modern GIS coordinates, which is a technical task but a feasible one. Once the anomalies are mapped, they can be compared with other spatial data: the geological map of each city, the heritage register of known First Nations sites, the oral tradition accounts of significant locations that have been documented in published or recorded form, and the modern development pipeline, the planned and approved construction projects that will affect the same ground in coming years. The spatial correlation would show whether the anomalies cluster in geologically significant locations, whether they correspond to orally documented significant sites, and whether they are in the path of planned development. The third step is community partnership. The spatial correlation in Step 2 cannot be completed without the oral tradition data, and the oral tradition data cannot be incorporated without genuine partnership with the First Nations communities who hold it. This is not a consultation process in the sense of asking communities to review findings. It is a research partnership in which community knowledge holders co-design the research questions, determine what knowledge can be shared and in what form, and are full partners in the interpretation of the findings. The design of this partnership would be different for each city. Gadigal custodians in Sydney, Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung in Melbourne, Turrbal and Jagera in Brisbane, Kaurna in Adelaide, Whadjuk Noongar in Perth, Palawa in Hobart, Larrakia in Darwin, Ngunnawal and Ngambri in Canberra. Each partnership would be shaped by the community's protocols and preferences. There is no single template. There is only the principle of genuine co-design. The fourth step is targeted physical investigation. Once the archival consolidation, the spatial correlation, and the community partnership have produced a map of the most significant anomaly locations and a research question framework that the communities have co-designed, physical investigation of selected sites can be planned. This does not necessarily mean excavation. Modern survey techniques, ground-penetrating radar, resistivity imaging, seismic tomography can characterize subsurface features at significant depth without disturbing the ground. In some cases, where anomalies are accessible through existing underground infrastructure, direct visual inspection may be possible. The investigation methods would be chosen to answer the specific questions at each site with the least possible disturbance to features that may be significant. The fifth step is publication and integration. The findings of the investigation, whatever they turn out to be, need to be published in forms that reach the multiple audiences with a stake in the answer: the academic heritage community, the geological community, the engineering professions responsible for planning and executing underground construction, the government bodies responsible for heritage assessment frameworks, and the broader public. The integration of findings into heritage frameworks, whether through legislative change, through modification of assessment protocols, or through the development of new guidelines for underground heritage assessment in development projects, is the step that translates research into protection. Without this step, the investigation produces knowledge without changing the conditions that allowed the evidence to be damaged and ignored in the first place. These 5 steps are not exotic. They do not require new technologies or unprecedented institutional arrangements. They require resources, political will, and the commitment of the relevant communities and institutions to the investigation. The resources are available in a country with Australia's institutional capacity. The political will is more variable. The commitment of First Nations communities to their cultural heritage is not in doubt. The commitment of government institutions is the question. The argument for investigation is not only that it serves historical curiosity, it serves several more concrete purposes. It serves the protection of heritage assets that cannot be replaced once they are destroyed by development. The argument for investigation is also an argument for action before the development pipeline eliminates the question by eliminating the evidence. It serves the relationship between the Australian state and the First Nations peoples whose cultural heritage is at stake. The failure to investigate the subsurface of the places built on First Nations country is not a neutral failure. It is a continuation of the colonial pattern of treating First Nations heritage as peripheral to the mainstream concerns of governance and development. And it serves the accuracy of Australian historical knowledge, a history that does not account for what was built and created on this continent. Before 1788 is a history with a significant gap, and filling the gap makes the history truer and the society that holds it more complete. These are not radical arguments. They are the mainstream arguments of heritage scholarship applied to a specific and underexplored domain. The domain is underexplored because of the structural conditions described in this video: the categorization of evidence, the institutional design, the gap between knowledge systems. The arguments for investigation are strong. The investigation has not happened. The two facts sit beside each other. Who benefits from investigation? Everyone benefits from an accurate historical record. The First Nations communities whose cultural heritage would be recognized and potentially recovered from the ground on which it was built would benefit most directly. The engineering and heritage professions would benefit from a more complete understanding of the subsurface they manage. The development industry would benefit from clearer guidance about what to expect and what to protect in underground construction. The academic community would benefit from new evidence to work with. The Australian public would benefit from a more complete and honest account of the history of the country they live in. Who benefits from non-investigation? No one, exactly. But the costs of investigation, research funding, political complexity, the implications for the narrative of Australian history fall on institutions and governments, and those institutions and governments have, so far, found the costs sufficient to delay. The calculation is not malicious, it is institutional. Institutions do the calculations of cost and benefit in institutional terms, and the investigation of pre-colonial construction beneath Australia's capital cities is an investment whose returns are not in the currency that institutions primarily count. The currency that matters to a heritage agency is heritage protection outcomes, sites assessed, items listed, threats mitigated. An investigation of the subsurface of the cities could produce those outcomes, but would first require a significant research investment whose returns are uncertain. Uncertainty is expensive in institutional terms. The investigation remains pending. The currency that matters to a development authority is project completion, approvals granted, construction completed, infrastructure delivered. An investigation of the subsurface that generates findings requiring heritage protection would slow and potentially stop development. Development authorities do not seek slowdowns. The investigation remains pending. The currency that matters to a government is political managing competing interests, responding to advocacy, maintaining public support. The advocacy for investigation comes from researchers, from First Nations communities, from heritage practitioners, from people who watch videos like this one and think about the question. The advocacy against investigation comes from development interests, from the institutional inertia of agencies that would need to redesign their frameworks, from the political complexity of revising the public narrative of Australian history. Governments respond to advocacy, and the advocacy for investigation has, so far, not been sufficient to outweigh the costs. This is the political economy of the unanswered question. It is not a conspiracy, it is a balance sheet. The balance sheet can change. It changes when the advocacy grows, when the evidence accumulates, when the public conversation about Australian history reaches the point where the question of what is beneath the cities seems not just interesting but necessary. It changes when the First Nations advocacy for the recognition of cultural heritage becomes politically unavoidable. It changes when the development pipeline intersects with an anomaly that is too significant to bypass without a political cost greater than the cost of investigation. The balance sheet is in motion. It has been moving in the direction of investigation for 30 years. The movement is slow. The question is whether it moves fast enough. There are people who have been working on this question for years. Not in the way that it is sometimes presented, not as lone figures making dramatic claims outside the academic mainstream. As careful researchers, working within institutions, producing peer-reviewed work, building a body of evidence that is slowly becoming impossible to ignore. There is a woman who has been working in the heritage sector in New South Wales for nearly 2 decades. Her formal role is in cultural heritage management for one of the state's larger councils. In that role, she has reviewed hundreds of heritage assessments for development projects across the council area, many of them involving underground works. She has seen the pattern from the inside, the assessments that find what they are designed to find, the assessments that note anomalies and classify them in ways that remove them from further consideration, the assessments that pass through the regulatory process and enable construction that might be destroying evidence of pre-colonial occupation. She has written about this in internal documents that have not been published. She has raised it in professional meetings where it has been received with politeness and not followed up. She continues her formal role and continues building the internal case, because the internal case is the one that can eventually change the internal process, and the internal process is where the decisions that matter actually get made. There is a man who retired 5 years ago from 30 years as a geologist working primarily in the Sydney Basin, sandstone, mainly the Hawkesbury Formation, the Narrabeen Group, the formations that underlie the city and the surrounding region. He knows those rocks the way a doctor knows a body, not just the general characteristics, but the specific behavior, the particular ways each formation responds to stress and water and time. When a colleague showed him the 1,862 survey report and the 1,921 Department of Public Works pages, he read them the way a geologist reads a field report. His assessment was immediate and direct. The features described in those documents are not natural geological features in Hawkesbury sandstone. The dimensions, the orientation, the surface treatment, these are not what the geology produces on its own. He knows what the geology produces on its own. He has spent 30 years working in it. These are not it. His assessment was offered informally to the colleague who showed him the documents. It appeared as a referenced informal consultation in a paper published in a heritage studies journal with limited circulation. The paper has been read by the people in the heritage studies field who follow this specific intersection of inquiry. It has not been communicated to the New South Wales planning authorities. It has not been incorporated into the heritage assessment framework for the CBD zones where the anomalies were located. The geologist is retired. He no longer has institutional standing. His assessment sits in the paper in the limited circulation journal, accurate and unacted upon. There is a Gadigal man in his early 60s who has spent much of his adult life working to document and protect what remains of Gadigal cultural heritage in the Sydney Basin. He works formally through the Land Council system and informally through networks of community knowledge holders and researchers and heritage practitioners that he has been building for decades. He knows the oral tradition of the Gadigal, the knowledge that was maintained through the colonial period, the knowledge that was suppressed and survived anyway, the knowledge that is specific to places rather than to general principles, the knowledge that says this hill, this waterway, this formation of rock matters, and here is why it matters, and here is what happened there. He knows which of the places the engineering records describe correspond to locations that the oral tradition marks as significant. The correspondence is not perfect. It is not complete. But there is more of it than a random distribution would produce. He has shared some of this knowledge in the research contexts where it was appropriate to share it. He has not shared all of it. Some knowledge is not for sharing with researchers at this point in the relationship between the Gadigal and the institutions that manage the land that is Gadigal country. The relationship needs to develop further before the sharing can be fuller. This is a reasonable position. It is the position of someone who understands the history of what happens to Indigenous knowledge when it is shared with institutions that are not yet ready to receive it responsibly. He is waiting for the institutions to become ready. He is helping them become ready, slowly, in the ways that are available to him. He is patient in the way that someone becomes patient after 40,000 years of relationship with a country. There is a retired metro construction engineer in Melbourne who spent 25 years building underground infrastructure in the city. He has been underground in Melbourne at levels that few people reach. He has worked in the geology beneath the CBD, beneath the inner suburbs, beneath the river crossings. He has encountered things in that geology that were filed in engineering reports and never discussed in any other context. He is not a heritage professional. He does not use words like pre-colonial or archaeological significance, but he has talked informally to researchers who do, and what he has described corresponds with the pattern this video has laid out. Features that should not be where they are, geometry that does not correspond to known construction history, ground that has been shaped before the shaping that the engineering record accounts for. He talks about it as an engineer in the language of concrete and soil mechanics and ground conditions, and what he describes, in that language, is what the heritage question has been circling. He is not sure anyone in the institutions he worked for cares about what he encountered. It was not his job to care. His job was to build the tunnel. He built the tunnel. The features he encountered are now in the concrete or behind the lining or beneath the floor of the tunnel. They are not accessible anymore. What he knows is in his memory and in the project documentation that he has copies of from his working years. He has thought about who he should give the documentation to. He has not yet found the right person. These four people, the heritage professional, the retired geologist, the Gadigal custodian, the metro engineer, are not in contact with each other. They exist in different worlds, connected by the same question but not yet connected to each other. There is no forum that would bring them together. There is no research program that would assemble their different bodies of knowledge and produce something from the combination. The knowledge is distributed. The question sits between them. They are each, from their own position and in their own way, closer to the answer than any institution has yet managed to get. This is what the distributed state of the question looks like from the inside. Not conspiracy, not institutional malice. Four people who know different parts of the same thing, in different cities, in different professions, with no mechanism to bring their knowledge together into something that could answer the question that connects them. The question is bigger than any one of them. The answer requires all of them. The program that would bring them together has not been funded. It is useful to look at how other cities have handled the discovery of pre-existing construction beneath their foundations. The comparison is not perfectly apt. Every city's situation is specific to its geology, its history, its legal framework, its relationship with the peoples whose heritage is at stake. But the comparison illuminates something about the range of possibilities, about what different institutional approaches produce. London is built on 2,000 years of Roman and pre-Roman archaeology. The city has been continuously occupied for that entire period, and the underground of London is one of the most intensively studied archaeological deposits in the world. Every major construction project in central London operates under a heritage framework that requires pre-construction archaeological assessment and mitigation. When London's Crossrail project, now known as the Elizabeth Line, was planned, the heritage assessment was integrated into the project from the design stage. The archaeological program associated with the project was one of the largest in British history. It produced findings that rewrote aspects of Roman and medieval London's history. It also added significantly to the project cost and timeline. The findings from Crossrail's archaeological program are now in museums and academic publications. They are part of London's public history in a way that the anomalies beneath Sydney's city circle are not part of Sydney's public history. The London framework produced knowledge. The Sydney framework produced engineering reports that sit in archives. The difference is not that London's heritage is more valuable than Sydney's. The difference is that London's heritage framework was designed over several decades of development and advocacy to find and document and recover what the ground contains. The framework was not always there. It was built by heritage practitioners who made the case for it, by archaeologists who documented what development projects were destroying, by a public conversation that eventually produced political will for the framework. It took decades. The result is a system that routinely produces archaeological knowledge from underground construction projects. Rome presents a different model. The archaeology of Rome is so dense, so extensive, so present at every depth and every location, that major construction projects in the city centre have effectively been on hold for years because of archaeological constraints. The Rome metro system expansion has been planned and replanned multiple times because excavation at every proposed location immediately encounters archaeology that triggers heritage obligations. The heritage obligations are robust. The metro is very slow. This is not an ideal model. It is a system where the heritage framework has effectively become a barrier to infrastructure development, but it demonstrates that a society can decide that the archaeology beneath its cities is more important than the speed of its metro expansion. Istanbul, for the same project, a new rail tunnel beneath the Bosphorus encountered one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century when excavation began in the Yenikapi district of the European city. The tunneling hit a Byzantine harbour that had been buried under centuries of sedimentation, and the harbour contained wooden ships that were extraordinarily well preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the silt. The project was halted while archaeologists worked. The halt lasted years. The ships are now in the Istanbul archaeological museums and are among the most important maritime archaeological finds in the world. The tunnel was eventually built. The archaeology was recovered. Both things happened. What distinguished Istanbul's response was not that the authorities planned to find the harbour, but they did not know it was there. What distinguished it was that the heritage framework in place was sufficient to halt the project when the discovery was made and to require the archaeological work before construction could continue. The framework created the space for the discovery to be treated as significant rather than as an obstacle to be cleared. Australia has heritage frameworks. They are real and they are increasingly robust for known heritage categories. The gap is in what they are designed to find. The Istanbul model did not work because someone anticipated the Byzantine harbour. It worked because the framework was designed to treat unexpected discoveries as significant and to create time and resources for their investigation. The unexpected is exactly what defines pre-colonial subsurface heritage in Australian capital cities: the unexpected passage, the unexpected chamber, the unexpected stonework at depth. The framework needs to be designed for the unexpected. There is also the Angkor-Wat comparison, which is less intuitive but more apposite in some respects. Angkor, the vast temple complex in Cambodia, was known in the Western archaeological literature for its visible surface features: the temples, the towers, the reservoirs, the causeways. It was not fully understood as a landscape because the full extent of its infrastructure was not visible at the surface. In 2012, airborne laser scanning LiDAR was applied to the Angkor landscape and produced a map that revealed an entire city beneath the vegetation. The city was vast, the city was structured, the city was built. None of it was visible from the ground because the jungle had covered it and the centuries had softened the outlines, and what the eye could see was trees and vegetation and the occasional stone temple. What the LiDAR saw was the geometry beneath the trees. The application of modern remote sensing to the subsurface of Australian capital cities would not replicate the Angkor LiDAR discovery. The urban environment is different. The signal noise from modern construction is significant. The geological variability requires different techniques. But the principle is the same. Technology exists that can see what the eye cannot. Ground-penetrating radar, resistivity imaging, seismic tomography, these techniques can characterize the subsurface at the depths relevant to the anomalies described in this video. They are being used in heritage investigations in other contexts. They are not being systematically applied to the anomaly locations in Australian capital cities. The reason is not technological. It is the same reason everything in this video comes back to: institutional will and institutional design. The technology is available. The will to direct it at this question is not yet present in the institutions that manage these places. What the comparison with other world cities suggests is that the Australian situation is not inevitable. London developed a heritage framework that produces archaeological knowledge from underground construction projects. Istanbul developed a framework that halted a major project to recover a significant discovery. Cambodia applied a new technology to an old landscape and revealed what the old methods had missed. Australia has the institutional capacity to do comparable things. The frameworks, the technologies, the partnerships, all of these are within reach. The question is the will. The will comes from the public conversation. The public conversation is where videos like this one live. The people who watch this video and think about the question and talk about it and share it and ask their own questions of the institutions and the governments that manage this, those people are part of the public conversation that the will has to come from. This is not a manipulation. It is a description of how institutional change happens. It happens because enough people decide it matters. The mattering spreads until it reaches the people who make the decisions. Then, sometimes, slowly, the decisions change. 50,000 years is not a number that human beings can hold in their minds without effort. The effort is worth making. The most common lifespan in the contemporary developed world is somewhere in the range of 80 years. 50,000 years is 625 of those lifetimes, laid end to end. It is 2,500 generations. If you use a generation of 20 years, it is the full span of human cognitive modernity, the period during which human beings have been biologically capable of everything that human beings do. Language, art, ceremony, construction, navigation, astronomy, agriculture, engineering, all of it has been possible, biologically, for the full span of human occupation of Australia. Every human intellectual capacity that produced the pyramids, the Parthenon, the cathedral at Chartres, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, was available to the people who arrived on the Australian continent 50,000 years ago. What they did with those capacities across 50,000 years of continuous occupation of the continent is a question that Western scholarship has been seriously engaging with for approximately 30 years. Before that, the dominant model, which was not simply wrong but was actively maintained against evidence that contradicted it, held that First Nations Australians were essentially static, occupying the continent without modifying it significantly, living in a relationship with the environment that was sophisticated in its ecological knowledge, but did not involve the kind of construction and landscape modification that leaves durable physical traces. The model was wrong. It was contradicted by the fish traps, and the eel channels, and the scarred trees, and the ochre mines, and the quarry sites, and the hundreds of thousands of stone artifacts in the archaeological record. It was contradicted by the engravings and the paintings and the constructed ceremonial sites documented by archaeologists across the continent. It was contradicted by the oral traditions of the First Nations peoples themselves, which describe a history of active engagement with the landscape across deep time that is not the passive coexistence of the old colonial model. The model was wrong, and the archaeological and anthropological community largely knows it is wrong. And the revision is underway. But the revision is a revision of a very old story. The old story is deeply embedded in Australian public consciousness, in the way history is taught in schools, in the way the founding of the nation is narrated in public discourse, in the assumptions that underlie heritage frameworks and development approvals and planning decisions. The revision of the academic model has not yet fully translated into the revision of the public understanding or the institutional practice. The knowledge that First Nations Australians built things, sophisticated things, permanent things, things that leave traces in the ground is academic knowledge that has not fully become public knowledge or institutional practice. This gap between academic knowledge and institutional practice is the specific manifestation of the larger issue. The academic community knows that pre-colonial Australia was not a blank slate, not geographically, not ecologically, not archaeologically. The institutional systems that manage the physical landscape of contemporary Australia have not fully incorporated that knowledge into their operating frameworks. The gap is the gap between what the research says and what the regulations require, and what the assessments find and what the constructions avoid or destroy. Closing that gap is the work that the people described in this video: the heritage professional, the retired geologist, the Gadigal custodian, the metro engineer, the academic researchers who have published on these questions are engaged in. It is slow work. It is underfunded. It is complicated by the political sensitivity of a question that touches on the foundational narrative of a nation that is still working through the implications of its colonial history. It is also necessary work, and it is the work that will eventually produce either the investigation or the permanent loss of the evidence that makes the investigation possible. There is a way of thinking about the 50,000 years that is not about scale or numbers. It is about continuity. The Gadigal people's connection to the land of Sydney is not a historical fact in the past tense. It is an ongoing relationship in the present. The Wurundjeri people's relationship with the Yarra is not a matter of historical record. It is a matter of ongoing practice, ongoing ceremony, ongoing stewardship. The Kaurna relationship with the Adelaide Plains is not a thing that happened and ended. It is a thing that is happening and continuing. The knowledge these communities hold is not ancient in the sense of being old and static. It is living knowledge, maintained, transmitted, updated in its application while its foundation remains constant. It is the living knowledge of people who have been in relationship with a specific landscape for a time frame that makes every other claim to relationship with that landscape look very young. When a Gadigal custodian says that a specific location in Sydney is significant, the significance is not historical. It is present. It is happening now, in the relationship between the person and the place, in the knowledge carried from generation to generation through a transmission system that has operated without uninterruption for 50,000 years. That continuity of relationship is itself evidence that the place has been important across the full span of that relationship. What was important to the Gadigal across 50,000 years left traces. The traces are in the ground. The relationship that made the place important continues. The two things are connected by a continuity that Western scholarship is only beginning to understand how to work with. The investigation of the subsurface of Australian capital cities is not, ultimately, a question about the past. It is a question about the present, about what the present owes to the full depth of this continent's human history, about what the institutions of contemporary Australia are designed to know and to protect and to recognise. The question about the past is also a question about who we are now, and what we choose to know, and what we choose to look for, and what we choose to preserve. These choices are being made continuously in planning decisions and research funding decisions and heritage assessment frameworks and development approvals. They are being made right now, tonight, while the cities are quiet and the ground beneath them holds what it has always held. The question is what we will do with what we know when we finally look. I want to go back through each city one more time. Not to repeat what has already been said, but to add one more layer to each place, the layer that is about what the evidence implies, rather than what it states. The implications are where the question lives most urgently. Sydney. The City Circle Railway was built between 1915 and 1926. By 1926, the tunnels were operational and the pattern of use was established. The passages described in the 1862 survey and the chambers described in the 1871 Paddington report are in the geology that the city circle construction passed through. The 1921 Department of Public Works report identified anomalies in the Town Hall Zone and the Circular Quay Zone, the two most heavily used stations in the network, the stations through which millions of passengers pass each year. The passages, if they survive, are beneath the platforms, beneath the feet of the commuters, beneath the engineering that manages the trains and the ventilation and the electrical systems, not in some remote part of the geology, but directly beneath the most used underground infrastructure in the country. The question this implies is not exotic, it is immediate. Is there anything in the tunnel zones that the engineering has not accounted for? The answer, based on the 1921 report, is yes. The anomalies noted in 1921 were not fully investigated before construction proceeded. Whether they survive in a form that can be investigated now is unknown because no investigation has been conducted. The metro expansion currently under construction in Sydney is passing through some of the same zones. The anomalies may be in the path of the metro. The Metro Construction Heritage Assessment would need to be designed to find them if they are to be found rather than built through. Melbourne. And the prior earthworks noted in the 1890s sewerage project are in the basalt of the CBD. Basalt is durable. The works that were bypassed, not removed, but worked around are potentially intact. The basalt formation beneath central Melbourne has not been comprehensively surveyed for subsurface anomalies using modern techniques. The planned Melbourne Metro Stage 2, which will extend underground rail infrastructure significantly in the inner city, will involve excavation in the central area. The basalt the excavations will encounter has not been assessed for pre-existing features that the earlier survey record noted. Brisbane. The Story Bridge, void 12 feet, circular cross-section, walls showing evidence of former use, is in the concrete of the foundation. The foundation was poured in the 1930s. The concrete is 80 years old. It is not accessible. What the void contained before it was grouted is not recoverable. But the riverbank anomalies from the 19th century construction logs, the prior earthworks in the phyllite and schist, are in a different situation. The river margin has been worked and reworked multiple times since those entries were made. The anomalies they described may have been destroyed. They may survive. The ongoing river management and flood recovery work in Brisbane involves excavation in exactly the zones where the prior earthworks were noted. Without a heritage mandate to look for them, the work will find them only if it finds them incidentally, and incidental findings are exactly what the colonial and modern record has shown cannot be trusted to be preserved. Adelaide. The Adelaide Parklands Lake is an accessible survey target. The stone arrangements noted by the 1930s engineers are in the lake bed, in the shallow water of the impoundment. Ground-penetrating sonar of the kind routinely used in underwater archaeological surveys would be adequate to characterize the lake bed at the relevant depths. The survey would require access to the lake surface. The lake surface is public parkland. The survey would require a heritage assessment framework that recognized the Kaurna oral traditions accounts of the river's significance as a basis for directing the survey. That framework exists in principle under the current South Australian Heritage Act provisions for First Nations cultural heritage. It has not been applied to the lakebed survey. The lake is there. The technology is available. The framework exists. The survey has not happened. Perth. The void with anomalous internal geometry beneath the Perth CBD was filled during the City Link construction. The filling was with grout, a hardened mineral compound. Grouted voids can sometimes be characterized by seismic techniques even after filling. Whether the specific geometry described in the CityLink engineering report would be recoverable through seismic analysis is a technical question that would need to be assessed by a specialist. What is certain is that the question has not been asked, because no heritage investigation has been directed at that location. The modification may be recoverable. The option exists while the option has not been specifically excluded by further construction. It is an open option sitting unused. Hobart. The dolerite quarry face entries from the 1820s and 1830s describe worked sections that were quarried away. The material is gone, but the quarrying logs describe specific locations. The locations can be mapped. The mapped locations can be correlated with the current urban geography of the lower Hobart CBD. Some of those locations may have been quarried in ways that did not reach the full depth of the modification noted in the logs. The work sections noted at 12 feet below the surface were encountered in a quarry, but the quarry typically works from the surface down, and if the worked face was at 12 feet, what is at 20 feet may not have been reached. The deeper stratigraphy at those locations is unknown. It has not been surveyed. Darwin. The military tunnel system, the documented, accessible, heritage-listed sections of it, is a known quantity. What extends beyond the documented sections in the sandstone that the military tunneling did not reach is not known. The Larrakia oral tradition references to underground significance in the Darwin sandstone refer to places. Some of those places may be outside the military tunnel network. The mapping of the oral tradition accounts against the military tunnel footprint, and the identification of Larrakia significant locations outside the footprint is a research task that has not been completed. The intersection of the Larrakia knowledge and the sandstone geology and the military engineering record is the specific convergence that would direct investigation toward the most promising locations. That convergence has not been produced. Canberra. The Parliamentary Triangle is the most politically freighted of all the locations in this video. The idea of conducting a subsurface heritage survey of the National Parliament grounds is not straightforward institutionally. But the limestone plains extend beyond the Parliamentary Triangle. The Ngunnawal meeting place was a landscape feature, not a single location. The limestone geology that the Parliament House Geotechnical Report characterized as containing anomalous features extends across the ACT. The full extent of the meeting place, as described in the oral tradition, covers an area that includes parts of the landscape that are not under the Parliament building. Investigation of those areas is less institutionally complicated, more accessible, and potentially as informative. The scope of the investigation does not have to be the most politically sensitive location to be significant. The less sensitive locations in the same landscape may hold the same evidence. These are specific, actionable observations about 8 specific cities. They are not calls for general investigation in the abstract. They identify specific locations, specific techniques, specific institutional frameworks that would need to be applied. The specificity is there. The will to act on the specificity is what is missing. We are getting to the end now. Not the end of the question does not have an end yet, but the end of what we can do with it tonight, in this video, in this hour. There is something about this kind of material that changes the way you move through the city it describes. People who have spent time with the pre-colonial history of the Australian capital cities, who have read the survey reports and the construction logs and the heritage assessments and the oral tradition accounts, often describe a specific experience of moving through those cities. Walking on a street in the Sydney CBD with knowledge of the 1,862 survey report and the 1,921 anomaly zones and the St. James Passage Diary entry is a different experience from walking on that street without that knowledge. The street is the same, the city is the same. The weight of what is beneath it becomes present to you in a way it was not before. This is not a mystical experience. It is an epistemological one. Knowing that the ground beneath your feet has been occupied for 50,000 years, and that the specific area you are walking through has anomalies in the subsurface that have not been explained, and that the oral tradition of the people whose country this is describes underground significance in this area, this knowledge is a form of perception. You see what you know is there, even when you cannot literally see it. The buildings of the Sydney CBD are tall and glass-fronted and contemporary in a way that seems to insist on the presentness of the present. The streets are full of the noise and movement of a major city in full operation. The underground, the metro platforms, the parking levels, the utility corridors, the basement levels of the buildings is full of the constructed present. And beneath all of that constructed present, in the geology, in the dark and the stillness, whatever is there is continuing to be there. Patient in the way that things are patient when they have no experience of urgency. Present in a way that requires no acknowledgement to remain real. Walking through Melbourne, knowing what the prior earthworks documentation says about the 1890s sewerage project, is to walk on a street that has a different depth than its surface suggests. The basalt is under the tarmac. The tram lines are on top of the basalt. The prior earthworks are in the basalt, somewhere below the tram lines, somewhere below the foundations of the Victorian-era buildings. The city has layers, and the layers go down further than the visible record accounts for. Walking through Adelaide's parklands at any time of day is an experience of unexpected quiet. The parklands create a genuine break from the city noise, a space where the older landscape surfaces briefly through the civic planting and the maintained paths. The lake is there at the center of the northern parklands, low and calm, the water reflecting whatever is above it. Below the water, in the mud, the stone arrangements are where they have been since the lake was impounded in the 1930s. The lake does not reveal them. The surface of the water gives nothing away. They are there regardless. Walking across the parliamentary triangle in Canberra at dusk, when the light changes and the formal geometry of Griffin's axes becomes most visible, when the angles between the buildings and the monuments and the lake align in the way that the design intended, is to walk across a landscape that is doing something with its geometry. Not randomly, not accidentally. The geometry is deliberate, the sightlines are planned. The relationships between the elevated positions and the water and the paths across the plain are the product of a specific intention. The question of whose intention, Griffin's, or an older one that the landscape itself expresses, sits in the geometry like a puzzle that does not quite announce itself, but does not quite allow itself to be ignored, either. These cities are full of present life. That is true, and it is important. The cities are real and complex and inhabited and interesting in all the ways that major cities are interesting. The history that this video has been describing is not the only history of these places. There are colonial histories and post-colonial histories, and the history of how each city became what it is across the 2 centuries since the colonial settlements were established. There is the history of migration and culture and institution building, and the history of how democracy and civil society and commerce and art developed in these places. The cities are not reducible to the question of what is beneath them. But the question of what is beneath them is a question that belongs to the full story of these places. The full story of Sydney includes the 40,000 years before 1788 and the 10,000 years before that, and the 50,000 years of the full continuum. The full story of Melbourne includes the dreaming tracks across the Kulin country and the eel channels of Budge Bim and the ceremonial cycle of the Yarra Valley and the meeting places of the plain. The full story of Adelaide includes the garner management of the Adelaide Plains and the engineering sophistication of the parkland's water system and the specific significance of the site that Light surveyed and described. These are not supplementary stories. They are the story. The colonial chapters are a fraction of the full story, however large they feel in the current public narrative. The current public narrative of Australian history begins, effectively, in 1788. Everything before that is described as prehistory, a word that in its Western usage means the period before writing and therefore before the kind of documented record that the narrative recognizes as history. The designation is not neutral. It places 50,000 years of human history in a category defined by the absence of one particular cultural technology writing, and thereby excludes it from the domain of history proper. This exclusion is not accepted by First Nations Australians, who maintain their own historical frameworks and their own understanding of the continuity between the deep past and the present. The exclusion is a cultural choice made by the dominant society. And like all such choices, it can be unmade. The investigation of the subsurface of Australian capital cities is, among other things, an investigation of history that has been placed in the prehistory category by the dominant cultural framework. What the ground holds is not prehistory, it is history. It is the record of human decisions and human labour and human life across a time frame that makes the colonial period a footnote. The ground holds the full story, compressed into its stratigraphy, waiting for the framework that will allow the story to be told. This video has been, in its way, an attempt to describe the contours of that story without being able to tell it yet, because the telling requires the investigation, and the investigation has not happened. What can be done now is to describe the shape of the question, the evidence that the question is real, the structural conditions that have kept it unanswered, and the possibilities that exist for changing those conditions. This video has tried to do those things. Whether it has done them adequately is not something I can assess from inside it. What I can say is that the question is real. The evidence is real. The people who are working on it are working carefully and seriously and deserve the recognition and support that their work has not yet fully received. The First Nations communities whose cultural heritage is at stake have been patient beyond any reasonable expectation, and the patience is a form of grace that the situation does not require, and that the recipient, the broader Australian society and its institutions, has not yet fully acknowledged. The ground is patient. The question is urgent. The gap between them is the space where the investigation needs to happen. Before I let you go, or before you let yourself go to sleep, whichever comes first, there are a few things I want to leave you with. Not conclusions, because the question does not have conclusions yet. Thoughts that I find myself returning to when I think about this material. The first is about the word beneath. We have used it through this entire video. Beneath the cities, beneath the streets, beneath the foundations, beneath the official story. Beneath is a spatial word and also a relational one. When we say something is beneath something else, we are describing a physical relationship. But we are also describing a temporal one. What came before? What was there first? What was covered over by what came later? In this case, both meanings apply. The pre-colonial occupation of these landscapes is physically beneath the colonial occupation in the literal sense that the colonial construction was laid on top of what was already there. And it is temporally beneath in the sense that it came before, not in the past in the sense of being gone, but in the past in the sense of being foundational. What came before is what the present stands on. The second is about the word question. Throughout this video, I have tried to be careful about maintaining the investigative frame rather than the declarative one. Not this is what is there, but this is what might be there, and this is why the question deserves to be asked more loudly than it has been. The investigative frame is not strategic caution or legal circumspection. It is the honest reflection of the epistemic situation. We do not know what is there. We know that the question is real, and the evidence is suggestive, and the investigation has not happened. Those three things are different from knowing the answer. The answer requires the investigation. The point of this video is not to tell you the answer. It is to help you see why the question matters enough that the investigation needs to happen. The third is about the word patience. I have used it many times to describe what the ground does. The ground is patient, the stone is patient, the evidence is patient. This is a way of describing the physical durability of what is there. But it is also, unavoidably, a description of what the First Nations communities of this continent have practiced for 230 years of colonial occupation of their country. A patience that was not a choice. There was no mechanism to refuse the occupation, but that was transformed by necessity into something that looks, from a distance, like endurance. The cultural knowledge that survived the colonial period, the languages that survived, the ceremonial practice that survived, the oral tradition that maintained itself through dispossession and violence and forced removal, all of this survived because people maintained it across conditions that were designed, whether deliberately or through indifference, to destroy it. That maintenance is not patience in the passive sense. It is an active practice of survival. The ground is patient because it has no choice. The people are patient because they made a decision, across generations, that what they carried was worth carrying. That decision is still being made. It is being made by people alive right now, maintaining knowledge in the context of contemporary Australia, working in the space between the traditional and the contemporary in ways that are complicated and real and not reducible to the categories that the dominant culture uses for them. The fourth thought is about what comes after. If the investigation happens, if the heritage frameworks are redesigned, the research partnerships are established, the surveys are conducted, the archives are consolidated, and the ground beneath the Australian capitals is characterised in a way that accounts for what 50,000 years of human occupation has placed there, what happens to the story? The story changes. The story of Australian history becomes longer and more complex and more interesting. The pre-colonial period moves from the category of prehistory into the category of history, with all the implications that carries for how the founding of the nation is understood and narrated. The specific locations that are currently understood as the sites of colonial founding are also understood as the sites of something much older and much larger. The significance of those locations deepens rather than changes. They were chosen for colonial cities because they were already significant, and the investigation reveals what made them significant. The relationship between the colonial narrative and the pre-colonial reality changes, not in a way that erases the colonial history or denies its consequences, but in a way that places the colonial history in its proper context as a late chapter in a very long story, rather than as the beginning of a story that had no beginning before it. This contextualization is not a diminishment of the colonial achievement, which is real. It is an accurate framing of the place of that achievement in the full history of the continent. And the relationship between Australia as a contemporary society and the First Nations peoples whose country it was built on changes, not instantly or automatically. Change of that kind is slow. But the recognition that what is beneath the cities is not absence, not empty ground waiting to be built on, but history, specific and deep and documented in its own forms, and surviving in the ground and in the living knowledge of its custodians, that recognition, when it comes, will be part of the foundation for a different kind of relationship, one that does not require the continued pretense that the pre-colonial history does not matter or does not exist. These are large thoughts for the middle of the night, or the early morning. Wherever you are in the cycle of your day, I want to thank you for staying with this for as long as you have. We have been sitting with a big question together, and that is not nothing. The question is real. The evidence is real. The people who are working on it are real, and their work matters. What you know now, having watched this, is a little more of the shape of a question that deserves to be more widely known. I do not know if this video will change anything. Videos do not change things on their own. They change the people who watch them, sometimes, a little, and those people carry what they changed into their lives, and their conversations, and their work, and their thinking, and that accumulates into something that is part of the longer process of change. This video is part of that longer process, in whatever small way it manages to be. The cities are above, the ground is below. Between them, in the dark and the stillness, what came before is patient. It is waiting for the question to become loud enough that it cannot be deferred any longer. That might take another decade. It might take another generation. It might happen sooner than anyone expects, if the right project hits the right anomaly in the right moment, and the heritage framework catches what the engineering would otherwise pass through. Timing is uncertain. Direction is not. The direction is toward the investigation. The investigation will happen. The question is when. Let yourself get sleepy now. Let the cities settle around you, whatever city you are in, whatever city this is. Let the traffic fade and the lights dim and the quiet of the late hour become the quiet of the almost asleep. The ground is very far below. The ground is not going anywhere. What is in the ground is not going anywhere. It has been there for longer than any of us can hold in our minds, and it will be there tomorrow, and it will be there when the investigation finally begins. Sleep well. The ground beneath you is full of time. You are resting on top of history, the way everyone always is, in any city, on any night. The history goes all the way down. There is more material in the archival record that this video has touched on only lightly, and I want to go deeper into some of it. Not because the earlier treatment was insufficient, but because these things deserve more time. The documents that contain the most specific evidence deserve to be read more carefully, more slowly, in the way that the hour and the quiet and the state of the person watching this late at night allow for a slower reading than the earlier, more argumentative sections of the video permitted. Let us return to the 1862 Sydney survey. The document itself, held in State Records of New South Wales, under a reference that places it in the infrastructure engineering correspondence of the colonial government, is written in the hand of a professional surveyor of the mid-Victorian period. The handwriting is clear and practiced. The surveyor was not a casual observer. His language throughout the report is precise and technical. He describes soil conditions, groundwater, the quality of the existing colonial drainage, the need for new works in specific areas. And then, in the middle of a paragraph about drainage requirements in the commercial quarter, his language shifts slightly. He describes encountering a passage in the sandstone. He gives its orientation as NNE north-northeast, using the compass-bearing notation that surveyors of his era used with consistency. He gives its approximate dimensions, 9 feet in height, with a level floor. He describes the walls as worked. That word worked is the same word he would use for a worked stone in a colonial construction. He knows the difference between a wall shaped by water and a wall that has been shaped by a tool. He is saying, in the professional language of his trade, that someone made this. The word worked appears once in the passage. The surveyor does not dwell on it. He does not speculate about who worked it. He describes the feature and moves on to the next drainage requirement in the next section of the commercial quarter. This is how a professional mid-Victorian surveyor handles something outside his professional scope. He notes it accurately, in the language he has for accurate description, and moves to the next professional question. The one word that tells you everything worked sits in the middle of a paragraph about drainage. If you are reading the paragraph for drainage information, the word passes without registering. If you are reading the paragraph for evidence of pre-colonial construction, it stops you. The 1871 Paddington Chamber Report is similarly embedded. The document containing it is a report on reservoir construction progress, a standard engineering progress report of the kind that mid-Victorian construction managers produced routinely. Most of the report is about progress rates and material quantities, and the condition of the workforce and the weather delays. The chamber is in one paragraph. The paragraph gives the dimensions 30 feet square, 40 feet in depth, with a precision that suggests it was measured, not estimated. 30 feet square at 40 feet of depth is a specific space. It is not a vague void, it is a room. The two openings to passages running in different directions are noted with the same precision. The walls are described as dressed stone. Dressed stone at 40 feet of depth in an area of Sydney that was not the site of any known colonial construction at that depth. The colonial workers who excavated the reservoir foundations found this room at 40 feet and described it in an engineering progress report and moved on. The room was incorporated into the reservoir foundation. The passages were sealed. The reservoir was built. The dressed stone walls of the chamber are in the foundation of whatever replaced the reservoir when reservoir was eventually decommissioned and the site was developed. The chamber is there, its walls are still dressed. The passages it opened onto, wherever they led, are in the sandstone behind the ceiling. What was in the chamber? The report does not say. There is no mention of contents. This is consistent with the chamber having been empty at the time of the 871 encounter. What the chamber held before it was found or what its purpose was cannot be determined from the report. The physical features, the dimensions, the depth, the dressed walls, the passages, the direction of the passages are what survive in the record. The function and the history of the space are not in the 1871 report and are not anywhere in the colonial record. The function and history may be in the oral tradition of the Gadigal. The Gadigal oral tradition, as maintained and shared by community custodians, includes knowledge of underground spaces in the Sydney Basin that were used for specific purposes. The nature of those purposes has not been fully shared in any public record, because the sharing of sacred and ceremonial knowledge with non-community members is governed by protocols that are appropriately protective. What has been shared in the academic contexts, where community members have chosen to engage with researchers, suggests that underground spaces in the Sydney Basin were known, named, and used in ways that were specific to their characteristics. A 30-foot square chamber at 40 feet of depth with dressed walls and 2 passage openings is a space with specific characteristics. Those characteristics are, potentially, consistent with a specific use and a specific significance in the Gadigal framework. The alignment between the physical description and the oral tradition knowledge has not been formally assessed, because the formal assessment requires the research partnership that has not yet been fully established. The gap between the chamber description in the 1871 report and the Gadigal oral tradition knowledge is a few dozen pages of documentation and a research partnership. That is all that stands between the question and the beginning of an answer. The pages are in the archive. The partnership is possible. The research program that would complete the pathway from the 1871 report to the oral tradition alignment has not been funded. Let me move now to Melbourne and sit with the 1890s sewerage records a little longer. The Victorian sewerage system was built under the supervision of the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works, which was established in 1891 and immediately embarked on the construction of the sewerage infrastructure. The records of the Board of Works are extensive and are held in the Public Record Office, Victoria. The technical specifications, the progress reports, the contractor communications, the workforce records, all of it is there in significant volume. The anomaly entries in the sewerage records are scattered across multiple volumes. They are not collected in any single place. Finding them requires reading through a significant quantity of routine engineering documentation, the kind of routine documentation that is accurate and complete in its own terms but is not structured to highlight the anomalous. The anomalies appear where they appear, noted in the same tone as the routine material, in the same handwriting, on the same pages. You find them by reading, not by searching, because they are not indexed in terms that make them findable as anomaly documentation. The prior earthworks noted in those records are described in language that is similar to the Brisbane and Sydney records, careful, professional, noting the features as something encountered rather than something expected. In several cases, the works are described as being of prior construction, meaning the workers recognized them as constructed, not natural. In at least one case, the description includes the observation that the construction was of significant age, using language similar to what appears in the Brisbane records from the same era. These workers, doing largely the same kind of work in the same decade, were making the same observation about different cities. That the ground they were working in had been worked before, that the prior working was not recent, that the prior working was significant in scale. The demographic of these workers is also worth noting. The men who built the sewerage systems of Melbourne and Brisbane and Sydney in the 1880s and 1890s were mostly working class, many of them first or second generation Irish or English immigrants, some of them former miners with experience of underground work. They were not archaeologists or historians. They were men who worked with stone and soil and understood those materials at a practical level. When a man who has spent his working life moving rock says that the rock in front of him shows signs of prior working, that assessment has a practical basis. He knows what worked rock looks like because he spends his days working rock. His assessment is not academic, it is experiential. And the experience of experienced rock workers across multiple cities in multiple decades produced the same consistent assessment: worked, prior, significant. These workers' observations are the most direct evidence in the colonial record that something was there, not the conclusions of heritage researchers or the interpretations of archaeologists or the analysis of geologists. The practical assessments of working men who encountered features in the ground that their experience told them were made. The record of their assessments is in the engineering diaries and progress reports and construction logs that are in the public archives of multiple Australian states. The assessments have been sitting in those archives since they were written, waiting for someone to read them as something other than routine engineering documentation. They are the closest thing to a direct witness account that the colonial record contains. There are two ways of knowing the ground beneath these cities: the engineering way and the custodial way. These two ways have not been asked to speak to each other in any formal institutional process, and the silence between them is the silence in which the question has been living for 200 years. The engineering way of knowing the ground produces specifications and depths and bearing directions and material assessments and void dimensions and settlement rates. It produces knowledge that can be used to build safely and efficiently and in conformity with the structural requirements of what is going above. This knowledge is rigorous and it is necessary, and it has built everything visible in the cities we have been talking about. The engineering record is not wrong. The engineering record is the most accurate documentary account of what the ground contains at specific locations at specific times during specific construction operations. The anomalies in the engineering record are in it because the engineers were doing their jobs accurately. The problem is not the accuracy. The problem is the framework that determines what the engineer does with the accurate observation once it is made. The custodial way of knowing the ground produces a different kind of record. It produces an account of the ground that is relational, not what the ground is in terms of its mechanical properties, but what the ground is in terms of its history and its significance and its relationship with the people who have lived on and with it. The custodial knowledge is not abstract or decorative. It is practical knowledge that has served its communities across the full span of human occupation of the continent. The knowledge of where the ground is safe and where it is not, where water is and how it moves, where the geology opens into spaces and what those spaces can be used for. This is practical knowledge that has sustained life across deep time. It is not less rigorous than the engineering knowledge. It is rigorous in different terms, applied to different questions, transmitted through different systems. What would happen if the two ways of knowing were brought into conversation, not in the academic sense of an interdisciplinary workshop, but in the practical sense of a research partnership that used both bodies of knowledge to direct an investigation? The engineering knowledge would provide the location data, the coordinates of the anomalies, the depths, the dimensions described in the historical record, the current subsurface survey data. The custodial knowledge would provide the cultural framework, the significance of the locations, the function of underground spaces as described in the oral tradition, the relationship between specific features and specific cultural practices. The two together would produce something neither produces alone: a map of the significant underground that connects the physical evidence with its historical and cultural context. This is not a novel research methodology. It is an extension of the community archaeology model that has been developed in the Australian context over the past 3 decades. Community archaeology research conducted in genuine partnership with the communities whose heritage is being investigated has produced significant results in the Australian archaeological context, particularly for the investigation of surface sites. The extension of this model to subsurface heritage, and specifically to the urban subsurface, is the specific gap that has not been filled. The extension requires what every genuine partnership requires: trust and the time to build it. The trust between First Nations communities and the institutions of the Australian state is not a given. It has been damaged by 200 years of dispossession and broken agreements and systematic undermining of cultural authority. The trust that exists has been built carefully by individuals on both sides: heritage practitioners, community advocates, researchers, government officials who have chosen to invest in the relationship rather than treat it as procedural. The building of trust is not a precondition for investigation in the sense that it must be completed before investigation can begin. It is an ongoing process that shapes the investigation as it proceeds. It is already underway. It needs more investment and more support than it currently receives. There are heritage practitioners in each capital city who have established working relationships with the custodial communities of their area. These relationships are professional relationships with personal dimensions. They involve the sustained engagement over time that makes genuine collaboration possible. These practitioners are the people through whom the investigation would need to flow. They have the relationships and the cultural competency and the professional credibility to navigate the institutional and community dimensions of the research partnership. They are often the least well-resourced people in the heritage sector, working on the most complex and sensitive questions with the least institutional support. The investment that would need to be made to enable the investigation is an investment in these practitioners and in the communities they work with. This is a concrete thing, not a vague call for research. An investment in specific people who are already doing the preliminary work, who have the relationships that the investigation would require, who understand the complexity of the question and are working with appropriate care. An increase in the funding of Indigenous heritage research partnerships in the Australian capital cities, directed at the specific question of pre-colonial subsurface heritage, with a mandate broad enough to include the archival consolidation and spatial correlation and community partnership and targeted physical investigation described earlier. This is what the investigation would need. The cost is real, but it is not extraordinary. It is the kind of research investment that Australia makes routinely for other heritage questions. It has not been made for this one. The reason it has not been made connects back to something mentioned earlier: the implications of the answer. If the investigation finds what the converging bodies of evidence suggest, it might find if the passages and chambers and worked faces and prior earthworks are confirmed as pre-colonial construction, if the locations are mapped and characterized and connected to the oral tradition accounts of significance, the implications for Australian history and for the political relationship between the state and the First Nations peoples are significant, not legally destabilizing. The findings of a heritage investigation do not change the legal status of land or the constitutional framework of the state, but they change the story. And changing the story has implications for the moral and political framework within which the relationship between Australia and its First Nations peoples is conducted. These implications are not a reason not to investigate. They are the most compelling reason to investigate. The moral and political relationship between Australia and its First Nations peoples needs to be conducted on an accurate account of the history of the country. An accurate account includes what happened on this continent before 1788 and what remains of it in the ground of the cities built since. The investigation that would produce the more accurate account is the investigation that serves the moral and political relationship most directly. The reluctance to conduct it is, at some level, a reluctance to have the more accurate account. That reluctance is understandable in political terms and indefensible in moral ones. Eventually, the moral argument wins. The moral argument for the accurate account of Australian history, including its pre-colonial dimensions, is building. It will win. The question is timing. The timing connects to the development pipeline, which is urgent in a way that the long-term political argument is not. Development does not wait for the moral argument to win. Development proceeds on the current framework, which is not designed to find or protect what the ground may hold. The evidence that the investigation would seek is being exposed and potentially destroyed by current and planned development in the zones where the archival record points. The urgency of the timing argument is real. The evidence may not be there to investigate in 20 years if development continues at the current rate in the current framework. This is the practical argument for the investigation, as distinct from the moral and historical arguments. The practical argument is that the window of opportunity is closing. The evidence is durable in the geological sense, but not in the development sense. Concrete is more durable than even the most patient sandstone when the concrete is poured over the top. The investigation needs to happen before the concrete. That is the argument. It is a real argument. Whether it is heard in time is not within my control, or yours, or the control of any single person or institution. It is within the control of the aggregate of decisions made by the people and institutions who manage the relevant ground and the relevant knowledge. Those decisions are being made continuously in the planning approvals and the research funding decisions and the heritage assessment frameworks and the political priorities of the moment. Each decision is a small thing. The aggregate is what the future holds. We have arrived at the end. Not at the end of the question, as I said at the start. The question does not have an end yet, but at the end of what we can do together in this video. I want to take this slowly. We have been together for a long time, and I do not want to rush this last part. If you are still awake, I appreciate that. If you are half asleep and the video is still going, that is fine too. Let it go at whatever pace it needs to go. The thing I find most striking about this material, after spending the time with it that producing this video required, is not any single piece of evidence. It is the consistency. Across 8 cities, across different geologies, across different colonial histories, across different First Nations cultures, the pattern is consistent. Something was encountered. It was noted accurately. It was not followed up. The noting sits in the archive, and the follow-up sits in the absence. 8 times, in 8 different cities, over the span of 2 centuries. The consistency is not the product of any single decision or any single failure. It is structural. It is the product of a system operating the way it was designed to operate, which was not designed to ask this question. The system was designed to build infrastructure and manage development and produce engineering reports and keep accurate records. It did all of those things. The accurate records are in the archives, and they contain the evidence of what was found. The system just was not designed to hear what the evidence was saying. The capacity to hear it required a framework that did not exist when the evidence was produced, and that still only partially exists now. The framework is developing. The hearing is becoming more possible. We are not at the end of this story. We are somewhere in the middle of it, in the part where the question has become audible but the answer has not yet come. The middle of a story is uncomfortable in a particular way. You know enough to know that the question matters. You do not know enough to answer it. The discomfort of knowing and not knowing is what this video probably leaves you with, if it has done its job at all. The discomfort is appropriate. The question deserves to be uncomfortable. The easy resolution, either the confident claim that there is something significant beneath the cities, or the confident dismissal that there is nothing, there is less honest than the discomfort of sitting with the real uncertainty. The real uncertainty is that the investigation has not happened, and the answer is genuinely not known, and the conditions for finding it out are developing but not complete. I've been making these videos for a while now. The pattern of material I am drawn to is the pattern of the overlooked question. The question that is not exotic or sensational but is genuinely hard and genuinely unanswered and deserves more attention than it gets. The subsurface of Australian capital cities is a perfect instance of that pattern. It is not sensational. The engineering records and the oral tradition accounts are not dramatic in the way that the word mystery usually implies. They are steady and patient and accumulative, the way that real evidence is. The drama is in the accumulation, not in any single piece. And the accumulation, laid out the way this video has tried to lay it out, produces a question that is hard and genuine and unanswered and important. I hope that comes across. I hope the steadiness of the argument is more persuasive than a dramatic presentation would be, because the steadiness is more honest, and because the question, once it is inside you, does not need drama to stay there. It stays because it is real. It stays. Because once you have read the 1,862 survey report, and the 1,871 chamber description, and the 1,921 anomaly pages, and the Eastern Suburbs engineer's diary entry, with the word outstanding underlined, once you have those things in your mind, and you stand in the Sydney CBD, or walk through Melbourne's basalt streets, or cross the Parliamentary Triangle at dusk, the question is there with you. Steady and patient, the way the ground itself is steady and patient. That is what I am trying to give you with this video. Not a conclusion, a question that stays with you. A question with enough specificity to be real. Real locations, real documents, real people, real research, and enough openness to be genuinely open. The question stays with you, and it changes the way you move through the cities, and the way you think about what Australian history contains, and what it has not yet fully faced. The facing will come. The history of how Australia has been dealing with the full reality of its pre-colonial past is a history of slow and contested expansion of acknowledgement. 40 years ago, the idea that the First Nations peoples of Australia had a sovereignty that preceded the colonial state, and that the colonial state had never extinguished, was a fringe argument in Australian public discourse. Now it is a mainstream legal and political position. However contested the implementation remains. 20 years ago, the idea that the pre-colonial management of the Australian landscape involved sophisticated engineering on the scale of the Budj Bim eel channels was not widely known outside specialist academic circles. Now it is publicly celebrated and UNESCO recognized. The expansion of acknowledgement is real, even when it is slow and contested. The expansion will eventually reach the underground of the capital cities. The acknowledgement that what is beneath those cities is part of the full history of the country, and that the full history deserves investigation and protection will come. The timing remains uncertain. The direction is not. I want to say something to the First Nations people who may be watching this. If you are Gadigal or Wurundjeri or Turrbal or Kaurna or Whadjuk Noongar or Palawa or Larrakia or Noongarwal, and you have watched this video about your country and your cultural heritage and the history of what was built on it, I hope this was handled with respect. I hope the knowledge shared here was shared in ways that were appropriate, and that the presentation was honest about its limitations and its uncertainties. I have tried to make something that honors the seriousness of the question rather than exploiting it. Whether I have succeeded is for you to assess, not me. And to everyone else watching, whatever time it is, and wherever you are, and however awake or asleep you are at this point in the video, thank you for staying. Thank you for taking the question seriously enough to spend this kind of time with it. The question matters more than most questions that get this kind of time on YouTube. It is about history, and it is about geology, and it is about the relationship between a country and the people whose country it was and still is. It is about what we choose to know and what we have chosen not to know, and what the ground holds regardless of our choices. It is a big question, dressed in the clothes of an engineering anomaly. I hope you can see it now for what it is. Go to sleep, or go about your day. Let the ground beneath you be what it is, full of time, full of history, full of the patient evidence of everything that happened on this continent before the history you were taught begins. It is all there. Most of it is still there. The question of what it is will eventually be answered. I will be back. There is more material in the archives of this continent that deserves this kind of attention, and I will keep bringing it here. Subscribe if you want to stay with it. Leave a comment below about where you are and what time it is. Tell me if the question stayed with you. Tell me what you are thinking, wherever you are, in whatever city, above whatever ground. The channel exists because of the people who show up for this kind of video. Long, slow, careful, quiet, staying with the material past the point where the drama has ended and the real thinking begins. You are those people. That is why I keep making these. Until next time, sleep well. The ground is patient, so am I. I want to add one more thing before the video ends. Not a summary, not a conclusion, we have been through enough of those. Something closer to an observation that sits outside the argument and alongside it. Every city that has ever been built has been built on something. This is physically obvious. You cannot build without ground to build on. But it is also historically true in a deeper sense. Every site of settlement is a site because someone determined it to be a good site. And the reasons that any given site is a good site are reasons that transcend particular cultures and particular historical moments. The same qualities that made the bend in the Yarra River a significant place for the Wurundjeri, the access to water, the shelter, the natural crossing point, the elevated positions with broad views, made it the site that the colonial settlers chose for Melbourne. The convergence is not coincidence. It is the convergence of human practical intelligence across different cultures and different eras, arriving at the same conclusion about the same landscape. This convergence is one of the most interesting facts about the locations of Australian cities. The colonial surveyor and the First Nations custodian, operating with completely different knowledge systems and completely different relationships to the landscape, agreed on which places were the best places. The agreement was not conscious. The colonial surveyor was not consulting the First Nations custodian for the most part, though in some cases there were significant interactions. The agreement arose from the shared, practical intelligence of human beings assessing the same landscape. The practical intelligence transcended the cultural difference. What this means for the question of pre-colonial construction is significant. The places that were best for colonial settlement were also the places that had been most intensively occupied for the longest periods. The most significant First Nations places are the same places as the colonial capital sites, which means they are the places where the deepest and most sustained pre-colonial modification of the landscape would be expected. The places most likely to show evidence of pre-colonial construction are the places where the colonial cities were built. The evidence is most likely to be beneath the cities. The cities are on top of the evidence. The pattern is not a mystery. It is the product of two different populations, separated in time, making the same correct assessment of the best places. This removes the element of coincidence from the question. We do not need to appeal to anything mysterious to explain why the evidence would be beneath the cities. The evidence would be beneath the cities for exactly the reason that the cities are where they are, because the best places are the best places, and the best places have been the best places for 50,000 years, and 50,000 years of intensive occupation of the best places, leaves, traces, and the traces are in the ground beneath the cities because that is where the occupation was deepest and most sustained. The logic of the situation is plain. The evidence is where you would expect it to be. The investigation has not happened for reasons that have been described at length in this video. The situation is what it is, not mysterious, not conspiratorial, but significant and urgent and pointing in a clear direction. That direction is toward the investigation, toward the archival consolidation and the spatial correlation and the community partnership and the physical survey, toward the research program that brings the engineering anomaly record and the oral tradition knowledge into conversation, toward the heritage framework that is designed to find what the ground contains rather than to find only what the framework was designed to look for, toward the public conversation about the full depth of Australian history, toward the answer, however long it takes to reach. I have been saying throughout this video that the ground is patient. The ground is patient. But the people who carry the knowledge of what the ground holds are not geological. They are human. They live and age, and the knowledge they carry, however carefully transmitted, is at risk in the way that all human knowledge is at risk. The urgency of the investigation is not only about the development pipeline destroying physical evidence. It is also about the transmission of knowledge across generations under conditions that are difficult and that have been made more difficult by 2 centuries of colonial disruption. The knowledge holders who can contribute to the investigation are here now. The archives are here now, The technology is here now. The frameworks are developing. The moment to begin is closer to now than it has ever been. Beginning is the thing that is still pending. I think about this material a lot, more than is probably efficient for a person with other things to do. But the question has a quality that makes it hard to set aside. It is the quality of a thing that matters, that genuinely matters, in the sense of having real consequences for real people and for the honest accounting of a history that is still being negotiated. The question of what is beneath the cities is a question about who Australia is and what it is built on, not metaphorically. Literally and metaphorically at the same time, in the way that the best historical questions work. That is enough from me. You have been patient, and I have tried to be worth your patience. The question is with you now. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever ground you are resting on, it will still be there when you wake up. The ground will still be there, the archives will still be there, the research community will still be there, working with what it has. And somewhere beneath the cities, in the dark and the stillness, what the ground holds is patient and present and real. One last thing. One genuinely last thing before the video ends. The cities above ground are visible and known and mapped and photographed and written about and studied and argued over and celebrated and criticized and navigated daily by millions of people who know them well. The streets have names. The buildings have histories. The parks have schedules. The trains run on timetables. Everything above the surface is accounted for, in the sense that it exists within frameworks that name it and track it and assign it to categories that determine how it is managed. The above-ground city is administered. It is known in the administrative sense. The below-ground city, the geological and archaeological and historical underground that this video has been about, is not known in that sense. It is known partially in the fragments that appeared in engineering records and survey logs and construction diaries across 200 years of development. It is known in the oral tradition of the First Nations custodians, who have carried knowledge of it across the full span of human occupation. It is known in the inference of researchers who have assembled the fragments and begun to see the pattern. But it is not known in the administrative sense. It is not mapped in the heritage sense. It is not protected in the legal sense. It is not part of the official account of what these cities are built on. That is the gap between the official account and the full reality. The gap has been described and examined and argued about in this video. The description and the examination and the argument are real, but they are not the gap closing. The gap closes when the investigation happens. The investigation happens when the decision is made to do it. The decision is made by the people and institutions who have the authority and resources to make it. Those people and institutions are not watching this video, for the most part. But the people who do watch this video are part of the public conversation that eventually influences the people and institutions who make the decisions. The chain is long and slow. It is real. You are part of it now by having watched this far. What you do with what you know is your own business. But you know more than you did 3 hours ago. The knowing changes things, slowly, in the way that all genuine knowing changes things. The cities you walk through, if you walk through Australian cities, will be different cities now. The ground will have a different quality. The depth will be present in a way it was not before. That is enough. That is what a video like this can do. The rest is the work of the people doing the work, and the support of the people who support them, and the patience of the ground that holds everything. Sleep now, or wake now, whichever is true for you. The cities are above, the ground is below, the question is alive, the answer is coming. There is a tradition in some indigenous cultures around the world of naming the ground, not the land in general, the specific ground. The ground of a specific place, known well enough to have a name, known well enough that the name carries the history of what happened there and what was built there and what the ground holds. The ground of the places that became Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Hobart, Darwin, and Canberra has names in the languages of their custodial peoples. Those names carry knowledge that the engineering surveys and the construction logs cannot carry. The knowledge is in the language, in the name, in the tradition of speaking the name, in connection with the place. The cities have covered the named ground, but they have not covered the names. The names persist in the communities that hold them, in the languages that carry them, in the knowledge systems that transmit them across time. The named ground is beneath the city. The name is above it, in the people who speak it, in the tradition that keeps it alive. When the investigation comes, and it will need both. It will need the engineering coordinates of the anomaly locations, and it will need the names and what the names carry. The investigation that uses only the engineering record will find coordinates without meaning. The investigation that uses only the oral tradition will have meaning without location. The investigation that uses both will have something closer to the full picture. The full picture is what the question deserves. The full picture has been waiting. It will keep waiting, with the patience of the ground and the persistence of the knowledge that names the ground, until the investigation begins. The cities are heavy and the ground is patient, and the question remains open, in the dark beneath everything that was built, waiting for the moment when looking becomes possible and the answer begins. The investigation will come. The full picture of what is beneath these cities, named and mapped and understood in the terms of all the knowledge systems that bear on it, will eventually exist. The ground will still be there when it does. So will the knowledge. So will the question, patient as stone, waiting in the dark beneath everything that was built above it. The cities hold what they hold. The time is what it is. The investigation will come. The full picture of what is beneath these cities, named and mapped and understood in the terms of all the knowledge systems that bear on it, will eventually exist. The ground will still be there when it does. So will the knowledge that names the ground. The stone is patient. The investigation is possible. The answer is coming. The patient ground will still be waiting for it.